Hello everyone, this is Thersites the Historian. I'm joined this evening by Sean Chick, and we're going to be taking a look at the presidency of one James E. Carter, better known as Jimmy Carter. We have a couple of things we'd like to plug first before we get into the main event of the evening, though. So, Sean, could you talk about your brother's Substack account? Pull that up real
Okay,
fast.
sure. Yeah, my brother does a lot of bad movie reviews, and he was posting to Facebook for years, and some of them are pretty funny. So I was like trying to tell him he should put them on something else, like another type of format, one that's easier for people to search. He didn't do that because he's kind of lazy. Um, so I'm putting them on a Substack called Dancing Sandwiches. It's entirely free. So there's a link in the description. If you just subscribe, you'll just get an email. There'll never be a charge for it, but that way, if you're really into bad movies, for instance, you can get all sorts of great recommendations.
Nice. And also, speaking of Substack, apparently there are a number of major journalists whose work is now available solely via Substack. So if you want to read Matt Taibbi or Glenn Greenwald, you would also need to find them on Substack. So for those of you
Yeah.
interested in that, as a bonus, you can get free bad movie reviews from Danny Schick. All right. The other
Oh
thing...
man.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, you go ahead. Go ahead, man.
Okay. Well, the other thing I'd like to plug is that I am going to do sort of an addendum to tonight's stream, but my addendum will be on my Spirit of Thersites channel. Let's pull that up real fast. Some of you are not subscribed to that yet, and if not, this is a good chance to rectify that bad decision. It was at 666 earlier, now it's 667, so I'm not the Antichrist anymore. But anyway, this channel clearly has way less subscribers than my main channel, but as you can see, this channel is completely political in nature, so if you're interested in more political content, subscribe here. What I'll be doing in my newest episode on this channel will be to talk about how Jimmy Carter, once he dies, which because of his age will probably not be too far off in the future, how he will be repurposed as a saint for neoliberalism. That's something we'll touch on tonight, but if you want to get an essay about that subject, then subscribe to my Spirit of Thersites channel, and that's exactly what you will get.
Yeah. Spoiler alert on our end. We don't think he's actually like a true neoliberal. We can see why they would make him a saint.
Right. He kind of fits their narrative, even though he does not consider himself to be that, and the founders of the neoliberal wing of the party do not consider him one of their own. But a lot of the neoliberal rank and file and neoliberal journalists do count Jimmy Carter. So there actually is a debate over who gets to be in the canon.
I do want to point out great use of the Scarface quote there. I want my rights, just like Jimmy Carter says.
Yeah.
That said, I do have to say, I think this is the first time we've ever done a video where we have 7 thumbs and 3 dislikes already.
Yeah. Usually it's hard to get more than one dislike before the video starts, so that is probably my finest hour so far. As a
Yeah,
YouTuber.
I want why. I mean, like, is something going down? I mean, is it too much? Is this the Byzantium fanboys coming out?
I don't know. I mean, maybe Jimmy Carter, hurt somebody or hurt somebody's grandpa one time. I don't know.
Billy, it's a Billy Carter, right?
Yeah,
No,
maybe
never
Billy
mind.
Carter had too many Billy beers and he ran over somebody's grandma, and that grandma has 3 grandkids who have YouTube accounts.
So much like with Gerald Ford, I read a Jimmy Carter book. I did not read one with as much detail because I already have read other books related to Carter, so I had more of a background. You and also looked at some videos of speeches and campaign ads. What'd you do, Thersites?
I have mostly been reading a biography of Jimmy Carter from 2020 by Jonathan Alter called His Very Best. And
Oh,
it's an
okay.
interesting book. Just spoiler for the book, Jonathan Alter has a pretty obvious neoliberal bias, and he's one of the guys trying to push the idea that Carter is this great figure of neoliberalism, sort of like a savior figure in a sense, in terms of how Carter is not corrupt, but he still represents that ideology. So basically, Carter is the ideal for him. And he more or less
Yeah.
defends everything Carter says or believed. It's actually kind of funny because this is a guy who actually wrote a book once about FDR, then became a huge stan for Obama, but I think he's finally found his one true love in Jimmy Carter.
Interesting love.
And by the way,
Interesting.
Levant, I'm aware that the establishment is not a big fan of Carter, but once he's dead, he won't be able to talk back. That's what they don't like about him, is that he is not useful for their narrative. So once
He is
he's dead,
definitely his
though,
own,
what's he not say?
he's definitely his own man. Also, I regret to inform that I had planned on having some peanuts tonight, and I kept wandering around. It's gotten hot here in New Orleans, so I'm not always together with it. After being outside, and I forgot to pick up the peanuts. I have to say.
I didn't think of doing that. I also didn't have peanut butter today either. Oh well. I'm just glad I remembered to call my mom and my grandma for Mother's Day. I almost forgot to do that too. So, yeah.
All right.
Anyhow,
So
we had a super chat real fast. It's from Zach White for $4.99. Thank you. He just said, "Hello from Georgia. Excited about this. Love Jimmy Carter." Well, we're going to be talking about Jimmy Carter quite a bit, so hopefully you will find this interesting.
Thank you, Zach. We'll be talking about Georgia's finest, or among its finest. So you want to go ahead and get started? We'll be talking about his background.
Sure. Well, Jimmy Carter was born in Plains, Georgia, which is a tiny town of 600 or 700 people in southwest Georgia. Very rural. He grew up on a farm, kind of had to learn to do a little bit of everything. And if not for Jimmy Carter, no one outside of Plains, Georgia would know that this town exists, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, no kidding. It should be noted that his father was not really rich, but was, well off for the area. He was a good businessman, but there were no luxuries on the farm or anything. Everything was kept very, very simple, if you will.
Yeah, although I do think that one of the formative influences in Carter's life, and one of the reasons why he was never able to understand the importance of labor and unions, is that his family were landholders. So even though their status, say on a countrywide level, would not be very high, their status locally was always pretty respectable. They were one of probably the 4 or 5 big families in town.
Yeah, do you know about this? I'd read that they mostly employed sharecroppers. His father apparently ran a company store, on the premises, so that whole thing's going on.
Yes.
But the majority of the sharecroppers they employed, I believe, were black. And I mention that because some people said, "Well, doesn't it make sense?" I'm like, no, actually, the majority of sharecroppers in the American South were white, but a disproportionate number of black people were sharecroppers, to be more accurate.
I think it had to do with the land ownership patterns in this particular region. Apparently, in Plains and the surrounding area, a lot of the white people own their own land, whereas a lot of the black people did not.
Gotcha.
And also I don't think
by
the
the
black
way,
people lived in the city proper of Plains. So,
gotcha. Well, city.
well, whatever you want to call it, the village, the town, whatever.
Everybody, so when he said Southwest Georgia, I just want to check real quick. It is very close to Andersonville, just so you know, for all the Civil War buffs out there.
I want to say, actually, as a state senator, Carter was really into historical preservation and helped get funding to make Andersonville a historical site.
Yeah.
It's either that or governor, one of the two.
Okay. So he did work on the farm, of course, which would be in keeping. Now, what religion was he raised at this point?
Baptist.
Baptist. Okay.
And it's worth noting that when Jimmy Carter was coming up, and this is a belief that he's retained to the present, he thought, well, baptism back then was all about the separation of church and state. This is before the age of televangelist. So this is part of why, after he becomes president, he has a huge falling out with the early televangelists such as Billy Graham and Oral Roberts, because they try to unite church and state to some extent, and Jimmy Carter says, you guys are betrayers of the faith, and you're wrong about what baptism is.
Okay, well, that's interesting.
Yeah, there's also another
uh,
reason we'll get to when we talk about his 1976 campaign, but he had a pretty severe falling out with them fairly late in the campaign. And something that he never
yes.
forgave them for either. He was pretty furious about it, and I understand why.
Okay, no, that sounds fascinating. I don't know too much about that one. I knew that he and the evangelicals had a complicated relationship that eventually breaks down. Of course, by 1980, the evangelicals, go hard in for Reagan. But do you want to go ahead into the Naval Academy, or do you want to linger some more on the childhood and planes?
Well, the only thing I would note is that apparently Jimmy's dad pushed him fairly hard to have a very good work ethic, and
Mm-hmm.
Jimmy also was more multi-talented than his father, because everybody back then had to be fairly multi-talented. If you live out in the middle of nowhere, you have to fix most of your own stuff. But by a fairly early age, Jimmy was probably the most handy guy in the house. He was the oldest son, and for whatever reason, his dad actually, I guess, cultivated an image of being super hardworking, but he was never as feverish as Jimmy.
Yeah, and but Carter said that he had to really live up to felt he had to live up to his father, and felt in that regard distant from his father. You know,
Yeah, and
which
apparently
it's
his
interesting.
father would only really lavish praise or warmth upon him when he was doing really well. Otherwise, he would, because he called him Hot, short for Hot Shot, as a nickname of affection. But if Jimmy didn't live up to his expectations, he'd call him Jimmy.
Oh, well, I say this that reminds me of Nixon. Nixon had a similar relationship with his father, who was not nearly as successful a farmer as Earl Carter. Uh, that said, I mean, I know we were talking about Gerald Ford's dad essentially abandoned him, but he got along really well with his foster, with his stepdad, if you will. So Ford wouldn't actually have this, would not have had, doesn't have the same dynamic going on. Um,
Yeah.
So one thing that I'd read about was that at least as a boy, most of Carter's friends were black, and then that changed in the teenage years because that was kind of the way it was in the South at the time. This apparently had some effect on the way that he's going to view race, which I want to get into when we get to his governorship of Georgia.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter's relationship with race was pretty complex. I know Jonathan Alter argues that he was always pro civil rights, this, that, and the other, but that he only really said anything around 1970.
He did some local stuff, but I know what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean,
We'll,
because
we'll,
the
we'll
things
get.
that he would do would be he would say, "Well, guys, there's a federal law. I guess we have to obey it, whether we want to or not." That was about as far as he would go. And apparently, he still got called an M lover and had people spray paint his building.
Oh yeah, and there was a boycott too that was put on as well. But anyway, we're getting a little bit ahead. Let's dive into the Naval Academy. He goes to Annapolis
He
during World
does.
War II. Yeah, but fun fact was Annapolis. He was bullied a lot.
Yes, he was.
Yeah,
Yeah, he
bullied
was.
a
He's
lot.
kind of a smaller guy. If you look at the pictures of him with the rest of the presidents, he's noticeably shorter. And he also has a very distinctive big grin, which some people sometimes mistake as a sign of weakness.
Yeah. Also, he is. I believe he is the most socially awkward of these presidents in a way that would invite bullying. Like Nixon's kind of socially awkward, but there's a bit of a shrewdness there, right? That Carter. I mean, I'm not saying Carter's not shrewd, but you get my drift here. You know, Carter. Carter could come off as weaker than he was.
Yeah, I think he just had a look that some people saw as being weak. Something that was kind of
Yeah.
outside of his control. But also, he was always kind of a distant guy in a lot of ways, and he was never really able to relate to all the people around him completely.
Yeah.
So, for instance, he doesn't understand things like people feeling hopeless or people feeling like they're unworthy or that they don't know what to do because for him that just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that's a good point to make there. With one real exception, when I read about him, he's pretty much always been like, "I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that." He's extremely hard worker. He's intelligent, so he's almost always able to um, to at least have a goal that he can aspire to and one that he can actually achieve as well. So this is not a man who feels aimless, if you will.
Right, but I mean, between the energy and then having the ability to do just about anything fairly well, he's not the kind of guy who gets deterred. So that's not something he can really relate to very well, and that I think that kind of held him back a little bit throughout his life. But yeah, so also keep in mind he goes to Annapolis. This means that he does have, or his family has some serious connections, or at least some reasonably decent connections with the local congressman, because you always have to be nominated by a congressperson.
Like you said, his father is becoming a very successful peanut farmer at this point.
Yeah, apparently his dad was not all that good at the farming part, but he was really good at the merchant part.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And apparently he also didn't actually like getting his hands dirty too much, so when Jimmy turned out to be really good at manual labor, his dad tried to low-key put as much of that off on Jimmy as possible while he had to go do business meetings.
This reminds me of about Abraham Lincoln and his father. They did not like each other, and Lincoln hated manual labor. So Lincoln's dad would essentially hit him and be like, "You're lazy, son," because Lincoln just like, "I want to read books," and he's like, "Books are for sissies. Get out there and work,"
Yeah.
And apparently, when Lincoln's dad died, Lincoln's brother wrote him and said, "Hey, we're trying to raise money for the headstone," and Lincoln said, "Nah, that's okay."
Damn. It's cold.
Yeah, I honestly don't think any other president that I've read had a more negative relationship with their father than Abraham Lincoln.
It's probably accurate. I think his dad hit him too, right?
Lincoln?
Lincoln, yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. But anyway, after Annapolis, he's in the Navy. He wins over Admiral Rickover. You know much about him?
Yeah, Admiral Hyman Rickover. I have a picture of him here. He is the father of the nuclear navy, and apparently he had this really unique interview process where he would ask you things that were designed to piss you off to see how you'd react, and sometimes he'd give you challenges to see if you had balls or not. So there's one interview he did with somebody where he told the guy, all right, your orders are to piss me off as much as you can right now. So then the guy took his arm and swept Rickover's desk off, and Rickover said, okay, you're in. That really pissed me off. That was a good job.
That sounds like Admiral Rickover. I mean, he essentially was kind of the dictator of the submarine program for decades. Which is interesting too, because I doing Cold War naval research, I read a lot about that, and there were some people who argued that while our submarine force, of course, was the best, they thought that we got a little less creative by the 1980s because of Rickover. But I'm not going to step into that minefield necessarily. But
he also
Rickover,
served a usually long time. He was basically the J. Edgar Hoover of submarines,
or like Eric Raeder, the one who led the German Navy after. From basically 1920 to 1943. I mean, that's an insane amount of time for someone to be in charge of a fleet. And then you got like Rickover and, like you said, J. Edgar Hoover's another one. That's a level of dominance few men get to entertain over a military.
Right. I mean, so yeah, Jimmy Carter, even though he only worked with Rickover for I think 10 or 11 months before his father died and left the Navy, but this was a hugely informative period of his life. He learned about how nuclear reactors work. He helped to design the Seawolf. And he also developed sort of a weird complex about Rickover where he thought of Rickover as sort of a second father. I'm not sure if Rickover felt the same way. I don't think he did. But
to my knowledge, he didn't see Carter as his son, but they stayed in contact, and Rickover, held him in high regard. And Rickover is one of the first people to write him after he wasn't president.
Oh,
yeah, no,
because I know they became closer once Carter took office because, partly because Rickover at that point's in his 70s, so his career should have been over, and now he always needs a political patron to keep going. And then once Carter's like, yeah, you're like a dad to me. Come hang out with me and my family at the White House. Rickover's thinking, fuck yes. This is a dream come true.
Wait, I mean, Rickover was always very good at winning over politicians. One of his things he said was they started naming United States submarines. I mean, the submarines in World War II were always named after fish, right? And or dolphins. Rickover started having submarines named after active politicians. And when people were like, that's kind of incredulous, that's kind of low class, he just said, fish don't vote in Congress. But no, I mean, definitely, Carter, it was definitely more on Carter's side than Rickover's side, but they, to my knowledge, did stay in contact, and they stayed in contact after Carter was president as well. So, yeah. And of course, Rickover had to be happy. He's like, oh, great. This guy helped me in the early days of the submarine service, now president. I got it made.
Yeah, and of course, Jimmy Carter was very much a tech and gadget guy, so he thought of himself kind of as an engineer. So if you are a big tech dude in the military like Rickover, then Carter is your president, even if you didn't know him personally.
So yeah, but he ends up resigning because his father died and the farm was in trouble, right?
Yes, so his father dies while they're building the Seawolf, and he goes home for the funeral. His brother, Billy, at that point, I think is only 16, so he's not old enough to really inherit the business. And his mother also doesn't think Billy will be up to it because he's kind of a goofy kid. So she basically says, look, if you don't come home to own the business, I'm just going to sell it. So he's basically guilt-tripped by his mom into leaving the Navy. So it's literally the stereotype about Southern women using guilt to control their sons and husbands.
I can see some of that. Very, very crafty. Well, it works, though. Carter goes home, and apparently he looks at his wife, Rosalind, who was... she was also from Plains, wasn't she?
Yes, she grew up right down the street.
Yeah. Apparently looked at his wife, Rosalind, and said with a big smile, and when they got into Plains and they drove in, he said, we're home.
Yeah, apparently she was not very happy about any of this, though.
No, she was not. She was not. She was like, wait. You were a naval officer on the rise, a favorite of one of the top, not just one of the top naval commanders, but also somebody who's on the cutting edge of technology, right? Sky's the limit, you know? But I wonder if Carter looked at her when the Thresher was lost and said, that could have been me.
He might have. Well, apparently, in retrospect, as he's learned and evolved over the years, he was talking about, I guess we didn't think back then about how sexist it was, but we just go up to our wives and tell them what's going to happen with their lives. Because she did not want to go home because she figured I'm going to be next door to my mother and my mother-in-law, and they're both going to try to run my life. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. Also, Plains, I mean, I thought Carter definitely liked Plains more than she did, just beyond the mother situation.
Oh, definitely. And I think since he left office, they've been spending 1 week a month in Atlanta. So I feel like that might be more her idea, possibly.
He still lives in Plains, then?
I think so. I know he spends 1 week a month in Atlanta at his library. And he also spends 1 month a year with Habitat for Humanity.
Of course, yeah.
And then he also does trips in between to, a lot of times, sub-Saharan Africa. So he travels a lot still, even though he's, very old at this point, but still.
But yeah, this man doesn't know when to stop, and he always has to have a goal. One thing I did find out, though, is that while in Plains, he did support school integration, and that failed. And there was also an attempt by locals to get him to join some kind of pro-segregation group, and he said he wouldn't do it.
The White Citizen
And when
Council.
they said, we'll do it. They said, don't worry, Jimmy, we'll pay your $5 admission. He apparently said, I'd rather flush it down the toilet.
He literally did pull out a $5 bill and flush it down the toilet to prove the point.
He literally did? Oh, God. All right, that's pretty good. So but I think that this has a big influence on him because on the one hand, he doesn't go the pro-segregation route, of course, but the failure of integration and the fact that his store was boycotted for a time and he gets some harassment. Now, granted, it could have been much worse, but I think that experience is why when he does eventually go to the Georgia legislature, he's kind of gun shy about the segregation issue.
Yeah, I mean, his district was one of the most conservative in the entire country, probably. And also, one of the local sheriffs, I can't remember his name. I don't think he was the sheriff of Plains, but whatever county Plains is in. According to the civil rights leaders who had to deal with him, they say that he's possibly worse than Bull Connor.
Okay.
They're about on the same level.
Yeah, the reason why they went after Bull Connor, right? Because they knew that he was bad, but also stupid. Like, he was the kind of guy who's like, let's turn some hoses on, while the cameras are rolling.
Yeah, apparently the guy in Plains was a little more subtle, and he also knew how to CYA a little bit. So what he did is he arrested a bunch of protesters from the north and held them, and it was winter, so he had all the windows in the prison open, then turned on fans to blow that cold air closer to the prisoners, so they were shivering their asses off. And then when he released them, as a condition of their release, they had to write him thank you letters talking about how decently they were treated. So that way, if they were to complain, he'd say, well, that's weird because I have these letters here that say that you thought I treated you decently and respected your rights.
Yeah, it's another one I would think of is Leander Perez, who we might talk about sometime on here just because I find him one of the most fascinating American politicians. He essentially was the dictator of Plaquemines Parish down here, right?
Yeah.
And he did straight up say, he's like, all right, any of you come down here, I'm going to throw you in a dungeon.
Huh.
He took Fort St. Philip, the old Civil War fort, and refurbished it as a prison and said, you come down here, I'm throwing you in this building. And, so I feel like with Bull Connor, they were like, we've got somebody who's going to do this bad stuff, but who's also a pure D moron. Is the thing about this guy like Perez, just saying, I know we're kind of sidetracking here, but the thing about Perez is that in the 1940s, Perez literally kicked out state troopers and told the governor of Louisiana, you govern the rest of the state, I govern this parish. So, not a guy to fuck with.
Damn.
Yeah.
So, also when Jimmy went home to run the business, I guess this would have been early 50s, maybe 1953-ish? Something like that?
1953.
Okay. So, obviously his naval career got aborted effectively. He's back home in Plains, and he has to learn yet more random skills. Apparently, he also was a voracious reader, and he would sometimes disappear into the back of the peanut factory and read books. So even though Carter is living in the middle of nowhere, he actually does remain up to date on a lot of things and a pretty voracious reader.
He also wrote poetry.
Yes, he did. And apparently, after his presidency, he also wrote a novel about the American Revolution.
He did.
With a graphic sex scene.
Oh, God. Oh, Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
I remember running into that because he wrote about the war in Georgia, which is, under discussed, but pretty interesting. So, yeah, a graphic sex scene. Okay, well, way to go, Jimmy. No wonder you did a Playboy interview.
Well, yeah, I think when he did the novel, though, this was 2002 or 3, he went on a late-night show and he read part of the sex scene to the host.
What was he doing, trolling them?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he apparently, I forget, I was just reading about the account. I haven't seen it. I need to look it up. But apparently he got that host pretty hard.
Well, we're going to get into I'm going to get into the part where he got Trump in the 80s, by the way. Trump actually has something interesting to say about him, but we'll wait for the post-presidency on that one.
Yeah.
We know that Carter's going to be in the Georgia legislature, where he's known for being hardworking, anti-corruption. He's neutral on the segregation issue, essentially. He's trying to, ride the line there.
He also, apparently, right when he got elected, he and actually her name's pronounced Rosalind. It's hard to it's easy to forget that, but her name's technically pronounced Rosalind.
Oh, really? I'd always like every movie like the documentaries I've seen, and even she was in a movie. They called her like Rosalind.
I think it's just because that's how everyone else says it, so she probably just gave up at a certain point. But she was actually partly named after, I think it was her grandmother, whose name was Rosa.
Okay.
So
well, dude, I gotta say, American Experience got this one wrong. Okay.
All right. Well, anyhow, she and Carter both went to a speed reading seminar, so that way they could read literally every part of every bill, because that's one of his campaign promises. And because he was so overbearing and insistent upon this, a lot of the fellow senators would effectively just surrender to him on issues. Because they didn't want to have to work hard enough to fight him. So they said, okay, I know you'll read the bill, just take out whatever you don't want. Let me know later. It's fine.
Yeah, he was known for reading the fine print, yeah. But I know in 1966 he runs for governor and loses to Lester Maddox, who I believe is the last pro-segregation governor to win in Georgia. Became known for throwing black customers out of his Atlanta restaurant. And Carter lost the primary to Maddox. Understand that the Democratic primary is who is going to win governorship at that time.
Yes.
And apparently this is what led Carter to become a born-again Christian.
Well, that's controversial. I don't think he admits that so much.
Okay.
So
what
the
does he
story
say?
that
My book said something different.
Okay, so the story I've read is that his sister was some sort of spiritual advisor, but she's kind of like one of those people, sort of like Marianne Williamson, who's kind of a blend of traditional religion and New Age stuff. And she said that she had a conversation with him in the late 60s. He was still depressed about losing and was still entertaining political ambition. And she said that they prayed together and that he recommitted himself to Christ. Apparently, Jimmy, because he's from an older generation, has never gotten into that born-again idea. He thinks it's bullshit. He said, I've never stopped being a Christian. There are times where I've been more into it than others, but I've never needed to be born again. I don't know what that means. But his sister wanted to be like, yeah, Jimmy's president now is because I saved his soul. And Jimmy's response was basically, that's bullshit.
Okay, well, I read the quotes that he actually said that he was essentially had a religious revival. And that's what I've seen in 2 different books and a documentary from years back.
I guess it's possible he might have said something different at the time when she was still alive. His sister, I mean.
Yeah, that's actually very possible, and also when he's courting the evangelical vote, that has to help.
Yeah, because I know a lot of the image of Carter now is he was just a straight shooter. He never played politics. Bullshit.
You do not become president of the United States by not playing politics.
No, Carter played a lot of politics, and he played it pretty shrewdly, too, as we'll see when we talk about how he got to be governor of Georgia.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. You want to go ahead and dive into that one?
Yeah, so when Carter was running in 1970, he realized that the reaction against civil rights was still very strong in the South. So he ran basically the perfect dog whistle campaign. To the point that one of his former advisors later said, yes, we essentially ran an end campaign. Because that's what they came to be called. Basically, dog whistling about how you got to stop black people.
Yeah.
He never said it explicitly, though. But what he'd say is, I have respect for Governor Wallace. Meaning George Wallace next door in Alabama, who was the face of the Dixiecrats. He would say
also
go ahead.
The guy he's running against is Sanders. I can't remember his first name right now, but Sanders was a pro-integration guy, so he can't. It's not like when he's running against Maddox. Maddox is the pro-segregation guy. Now,
yes.
One thing to be clear about Maddox too, just to be clear, Maddox's views on this softened, as actually did Wallace's as well. But at the time, Maddox is the pro-segregation guy. Jimmy Carter's seen as soft on it. But this time he's running against Sanders, who is avowedly pro-integration, who had said that he never wanted to speak to a guy like Wallace. So if you're running against this guy, Carter's thinking is like, how else am I going to get him? I can't out-integration him. The integration people already have his back.
Right. So he ran sort of a campaign where he did the classic politician thing, and he kind of used vague phrases that didn't really tell you where he stood. He also did not commit to ideological labels. Sometimes he'd say, I'm a conservative, or I'm this, or I'm that, but it changed a lot depending on who he's talking to, and because this is still pre-internet, that was fine.
Yeah. Also, he hit Sanders in the class issue because Sanders, not mistaken, was a lawyer, and Carter played up the fact that, like, I'm a farmer. I work with my hands. I'm a hardworking guy.
He also ran against the Georgia establishment, which is the Atlanta establishment. So he would talk about how he's not one of those Atlanta guys, and he sort of did run a populist campaign. That's the biggest criticism I have of the Jonathan Alter book is that because Alter is a huge stand for the Democratic Party, and right now they're against the label populist in any context, he will not allow his hero to be a populist. But Jimmy Carter was one of the more successful populists of the entire decade of the 70s. And that started in 1970. He ran
definitely
openly against the Atlanta establishment, and that's why he got votes in rural Georgia.
Yeah. So he does the dog whistle. He does an actual dog whistle campaign. He uses his class rhetoric effectively, and he's now going to become governor of Georgia. If you were really into segregation, of course he lets you down because then he hires blacks and women.
Well, also, in his inaugural address, actually I think it was Victory Night. I don't think he waited for the inaugural. He basically said, the time for discrimination is over. So he took a fairly hard left turn right when he got elected. He literally did the thing that Republicans are always worried about that almost never happens, where somebody will govern left of what they run as.
Oh, to be fair,
one time it happened.
No, that does happen with Republicans on social issues. They'll on the more national level, they'll back down. Don't worry though, economics, they're to the right of Attila the Hun.
Yeah, I mean, also the other example I can think of is somebody who ran very, very moderate and then governed more in a more partisan basis, of course, would be George W. Bush, but that is a different story for a different day.
Yeah, sometime around September, probably.
Yeah. But anyway, with Carter, so he also knew, and this is key, and I don't know if this is still the case, but it was definitely the case in the 70s, you can only serve one term as governor. So if he pisses a bunch of people off, it doesn't matter that much.
Yeah, that's a good point there. That's actually why I'll say one thing. One of the features, if somebody was to say, like, what is a feature of the Confederacy you'd ever, like, say we should have, I like the idea of a one-term, 6-year presidency. Again, I think it's a good idea. But anyway,
it's not a bad idea.
you got to do the whole election thing, and there's a tendency for second terms to go haywire for a lot of different reasons. I just think one term. Hell, Trump filed for re-election like the day he was the first day he was in the White House, which I know was early. But you get what I'm saying? Like by the second year, you're already on the campaign trail in some ways.
Yeah, that's true. I think, too, a lot of people spend their first term trying to secure a second rather than really trying to govern in earnest. And when you get the second term, you kind of come in as a lame duck. So... Yeah,
because you've already lost some political capital and momentum by that time.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, actually. The 6-year single term might actually be a better way to go.
Yeah. So Carter... gets some attention as governor. Nothing to make him a national name, but he did get on the cover of Time magazine very early in his thing. It's an interesting cover. Have you seen this one?
I don't think so. Let me look it up real fast.
Put it up there. It's got this hand-drawn picture of Carter, and it's a younger Carter, a Carter we're not used to looking at. And the back of it has like the Confederate battle flag of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia next to the American flag, and it says Dixie whistles a different tune.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, this was apparently, according to Carter's staff, this is apparently when they first started to think, maybe we ought to go national if we're already getting attention from Time. And then, of course, McGovern's defeat emboldens him further because Carter did not like George McGovern or his people.
Apparently, he was one of the major figures in the Anybody But McGovern coalition. And it got to the point where when McGovern was nominated, there were people around him who said, you need to do a unity ticket to heal the party. You should choose somebody like Jimmy Carter. And McGovern, when he heard Jimmy Carter's name, because all he knew about him is that Carter had talked shit, he basically says something to the effect of, fuck that guy, I don't want to ever see him.
Was it like what Nixon said about the reporter he didn't like? I wouldn't give him the sweat off my balls.
It was probably something to that effect. It was a very negative response. And then after, of course, Eagleton dropped out, Rosalind, went around. She was actually trying to lobby on Jimmy's behalf with other politicians, saying, you need to tell McGovern to pick Jimmy to balance the ticket. McGovern once again declined to do that, and of course went with Sergeant Shriver. But speaking of Sergeant Shriver, who was in-law of the Kennedys, a lot of people started to think of Jimmy, at least his supporters started to think of him as like the Southern Kennedy. Just because
I don't know about
the
that.
Vague resemblance.
Oh, the vague resemblance, yeah. They're really playing that up in the Time cover, as you can see. But they are very much not alike.
No, they're not alike at all. But just the vague resemblance and also the general, at least, youthfulness. I mean, because Jimmy Carter, despite the fact he's still alive, you might think he was super young when he was president, but he's already in his mid-50s. Also, another thing he did as governor that was really fascinating, and also shows that this is a man of political calculation. So, he was a big conservationist, and in 1971, the movie Deliverance was shot on the Chattahoochee River, which I believe is to the south of the Atlanta area and south of the Chattahoochee River. And apparently has some of these really rough rapids. So what Jimmy Carter did is he went with the guy who monitors the rivers and did a stunt where they were the first people to go over a Category 5 fall in a canoe rather than a kayak, and they made it. So then Carter used that as a publicity stunt, and then went to Senator Scoop Jackson, who was passing a federal bill to create protected waterways, and convinced him to add the Chattahoochee River to the list.
Okay, wow, that's cool.
Yes, I mean, this is a guy, also, in general, very, very good at recruiting celebrity friends for whatever reason. Probably had more celebrity friends than any other president.
Really? What are some other ones?
Willie Nelson was a big one, and apparently they were close enough that Willie had been arrested in somewhere in the Bahamas for weed in the 70s while Carter was president. And then as soon as he got released, Carter invited him to stay at the White House, even though the guy had just been in jail for drugs. And then in the middle of the night, they let Willie sleep in the Lincoln bedroom. And Jimmy's son Chip woke him up, and they went on the roof and smoked more weed.
Oh, God.
And apparently Jimmy Carter and the leader of the Allman Brothers were really close.
I believe Duane Allman was dead by then. I do know that Leonard Skinner were big fans of Jimmy Carter, and they were like playing on the campaign trail for him in '76. But yeah, so the few things to note about the governorship: he had a bad relationship with his legislature overall, which is going to carry over into his presidency, as we'll see. Now, Carter can play politics, of course, but he's not very good at the legislative politics necessarily. Or at least not, I mean, you said he could barrel through things in the legislature and he was there because he was reading the bills. But once he becomes governor, his relationship with the legislature is not that great. He was known as a budget hawk, and his main thing in Georgia was also reforming the government as well. So he's kind of like seen as a government reformer, in some ways a kind of new Democrat in many ways, or at least a departure from some of the other New Deal Democrats, in that he is worried about things like expenses, and he doesn't necessarily like every regulation he sees.
Yeah, he's basically he's a fiscal conservative on a lot of issues, And he was definitely one of those guys who believed in balanced budgets.
Yeah, very much so. And to be fair, of course, so did Ford. And that's another reason too. I'm glad we're doing Carter so soon after Ford, because especially when we get to the presidency, so much of what plagued Ford is going to plague Carter as well. I mean, the Carter presidency really is the sequel to the Ford presidency.
Yes, the inflation crisis especially.
Inflation, oil, détente in relations with the Soviet Union. It's the same issues. But do you have anything else you want to say about him being governor, or do we want to get into the presidential campaign?
Let's see. Is there anything else about his governorship? He also did bust up a state political boss. I don't know if this was while he was governor or while he was still in the state senate, but when he initially won his state senate seat, he had to deal with a guy named Joe Hurst, who literally stuffed ballot boxes to stop opponents. And he managed to not only win the race despite ballot box stuffing, but then gathered information on Hurst and turned it over to the FBI, and Hurst's ring was busted up. And that also kind of pissed off people in Georgia, but it still did not impede him from becoming governor. It seems like a lot of his opposition in Georgia were just really weak-willed, lazy fucks. Because he just steamrolls them consistently. They don't like him, but they can't do anything about it.
Well, he was. I mean, some of it has to do with that hard work ethic for sure, both what he does in the legislature and on the campaign trail. I know this because I actually had a professor at Southeastern named Sanders, interestingly enough, and he wrote a book. I can't remember the name of the book right now. He wrote a book about the rise of like post-integration Southern politicians in the 70s. So he actually did get to interview Carter for the book, not too extensively or whatnot. And he's the one who told us about the way he did the campaign of the dog whistles. But he said one of the things that really struck him about Carter as compared to almost everybody else was just that insane work ethic. So when he's out there campaigning, I mean, he's hitting it hard constantly, which we're going to see in the 76 campaign, because his victory in the primaries is one of the most impressive I've ever read about.
Yeah, also something that ties together his work ethic and also his savvy, but combined with awkwardness. So he had a practice when he got on a plane, and this continued even after he was president. He would go around and shake hands with everybody on the plane, so that way when they were in the middle of the flight, nobody would come over to him and try to talk. So that way he could sit there and read or whatever he wanted to do the whole flight.
Huh.
Yeah. So, I mean, Jimmy Carter, very shrewd man, but also has to work around his own quirks. But, mostly he did so fairly effectively.
Yeah. Well, the campaign, he actually announced his campaign December 1974. This is a bit unheard of at the time. I mean, the Ford presidency is 4 months old, but the midterms are over. And he really just set off that tradition of, start early, run hard, get your ground game in New Hampshire, which was called the Peanut Brigade, apparently.
Yes.
Interesting fact, yes. He wrote an autobiography called Why Not the Best, which was a reference to his interview with Admiral Rickover. And that's also interesting, too, because you had presidential campaign biographies. Like, I run into them with Ulysses Grant and James Garfield, for instance. I think this might be the first campaign autobiography, though, which, of course, a number of people have used as either test balloons to see if they should run or can run. And, so I think he might be the first one to do that, or at least the first one in our era. So, but I guess it would have been unseemly back then for Garfield to write a memoir and be like, I'm awesome, so make me president.
Yeah, I mean, I guess at this point it's standard practice. And also having to start really early in the primary, set up a ground game, having to do well in certain states to prove your viability. I feel like Carter was the first guy to really lay out a thorough primary strategy, and everybody since has tried to follow that blueprint. Even the minor candidates we covered for 2020, people like John Delaney, were imitating Carter to a large extent.
Yeah, some of the stuff he does, McGovern anticipated a bit of it as well. But yeah, Carter's the one who really brings it to fruition. I will say this: there's this one historian. Well, historian might be stretching the term. His name is Paul Johnson. He's a conservative, and I really don't like him. But he had a funny line about Carter. He said that Carter had the dumbest campaign slogan of all time: "I would never tell a lie."
Yeah, apparently that did get him into a little bit of trouble anytime somebody found an exaggeration.
Yeah, but that's the thing. He had a point there. He was like, if you believe this campaign slogan, you're a sucker.
Yeah, it's interesting. Apparently, another exaggeration that he told was that he's a nuclear physicist because, he worked on nuclear subs. And
Yeah.
technically, to be a nuclear physicist, you have to have a degree in it. Carter did not, but he still knew about it. So it's one of those things where if somebody writes an article saying, haha, gotcha, now the people who are either predisposed to dislike him or who are super pedantic will say, oh, yes, you've caught him in a lie. But I think most people would say, who fucking cares?
Yeah. As the primary goes on, Carter steamrolls his opponents, even though there was a joke about, like, when he first ran early, like Jimmy Who, right?
Yes.
Which I believe was even a campaign ad that would play that up, where they'd show like a guy like looking out over a farm, and they had like this kind of like Lee Greenwood sounding music where it's like, and his name is Jimmy Carter. I haven't,
Oh, God.
Steamrolls his opponents. Now we're into the
Well, one more note on the primary, though. A lot of it was luck to a certain extent. I mean, not only did he run a good campaign, but he had anticipated having to run against some really heavy hitters, including Ted Kennedy and Ed Muskie and some other guys, but none of them really stayed in the race. And by the time
Teddy ran in '76, huh?
Teddy was thinking about it, but he ended up saving his ammo for 1980.
Now, Muskie, was this the one where Muskie got undermined by Hunter S. Thompson?
I think so, because Hunter S. Thompson was a huge stand for Carter. Actually, they had a weird relationship.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes, Hunter S. Thompson was a big Jimmy Carter supporter throughout the primary.
Let me pull up the this thing here. Yeah. He had Jerry Brown of California. God, that guy was just governor, wasn't he?
Yeah, he became governor again recently, the last 10 years. But also, he entered the race too late. He had a lot of momentum at the end. He won 6 states, but he entered at the last minute. It was part of a strategy to broker the convention to stop Jimmy Carter, because Jimmy made some missteps after he took the big lead.
I think Muskie ran in '76, because I'm not seeing him on the Wikipedia thing, unless he considered it and pulled out,
Yeah, he might have. Anyway, he face-planted. Carter wanted to run between Kennedy and Wallace, though. He thought that he could play the middle effectively, kind of like what he did in the Georgia primary.
Yeah, okay.
Neither one of them were there, so he had to change up strategy. And I think a lot of it is just that he was able to win over a bunch of farmers, and like you're talking about the Peanut Brigade in New Hampshire. These are 90 people from Georgia who personally knew him and went to campaign on their own dime. And when they'd tell people their stories, that really impressed them, and they thought, well, he must be a man of high character if people are willing to spend their own money to try to get this man elected, so I guess we should probably support him too. And that's also interesting because it's still the case, but it was especially the case back then, that if you're from the South, a lot of people, especially in New England, are predisposed to think of you as an ignorant hick.
Oh, you forgot. Ignorant racist hick.
Yeah.
Who, was ancestors are traitors, and you haven't produced any art or something like that, which is absolutely ridiculous. Anything about music and literature, But anyway, predisposition in the South. So it's kind of shocking he's able to win New Hampshire in that regard.
Although Iowa's not as surprising, just because it's all about farming, and Jimmy would go around talking about peanut prices and talking about farming in a way that made it clear that he actually knew what he was talking about and he wasn't just fucking around with it.
Well, they got those campaign ads where they have like the peanuts are just like coming out of the chute, and things like Carter's a man who works with his hands.
Yeah.
Who's the last president you could say that about?
Yeah. And I think a lot of it is just maybe I think people in the 70s were more open to folksy, kind of everyman stuff. It didn't come across as fake at that time.
Well, I mean, to be fair, Carter is a real deal in that regard. Now, I'm saying a real deal in that regard. Like, yes, his father had money, but he worked on the farm. He was a farmer, a very successful peanut farmer. Carter himself, I think by the 60s, his farm was like the second most successful peanut farm in Georgia. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, first off, Carter could back up these claims. That's the first one. Second is, this is the era when class rhetoric still is probably the top rhetoric in America. And you're starting to see it decay in the 70s. So you mentioned Deliverance. I kind of view Deliverance, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and some of those other movies at the time, which those are both great movies, by the way, but I own both of them. But a movie like that could never have been made in the 30s, when the idea of mocking poor people was considered like anathema, and you have the New Deal going on, and that really is like the American working man is the hero. By the 70s, the American working man, especially the American working man in the South, is like an evil, toothless monster who will rape you or kill you with a chainsaw.
Yeah.
And now at this point, I mean, as far as class rhetoric goes, we haven't been this far away from it since, I don't know, the 1700s.
Yeah, sometime before the French Revolution.
Yeah, I would actually argue that America, you don't actually have true class rhetoric in politics until Andrew Jackson, and even then it's very nascent, really. So yeah, pre-1820, I guess. So yeah. Anyway.
And in the primary, another important early supporter among Congress was?
No. What, Mike Gravel?
No, a 33-year-old senator named Joe Biden. As soon as Jimmy Carter won in New Hampshire, Joe Biden jumped on board and remained a staunch ally.
Okay. Do you know much about their relationship to this day?
I don't. I mean, I know there was that picture that went viral of the Bidens visiting the Carters. I think it was from this week or from very recently. And people have made fun of it because Biden is knelt down next to Rosalind, and people have compared it with Jeff Dunham and one of his puppets.
Wait, what?
Let's pull it up.
Right.
It went viral, and I mean, part of it's just because, the Carters are so old that they're shriveled, so they, look bad because they're in their mid-90s. Let's see. It's kind of a mean joke about Rosalind, but she probably doesn't know how to use the internet, so I guess it's not a big deal. But yeah, for whatever reason, the Bidens look like giants in this picture. I'm not sure exactly what it is. I think, it's somebody saying it's photographic distortion. I don't know.
Oh, that picture. Yeah, I saw that one. But anyway, let's move on to science. Let's move on to something that's actually interesting.
Yeah.
The 1976 election is far closer than people expected it to be. Carter had a massive lead. Now, we all know that there's a tendency for Democrats to have a large lead in the summer that narrows as you get closer in, for a variety of reasons. At any rate, though, some of this has to do with that Carter just has problems. I mean, there's that weirdness factor. You've heard about that before, right? The weirdness factor?
Yeah, he comes across a little intense.
I think he's a really bad public speaker. Ford wasn't great, but man, Carter's rough, guys. Sorry, he's not very good. And yeah, he just they can't. The staff knew what they called the weirdness factor. It didn't help that his plank was to have decent government, to reduce spending, yet to help people. It sounded contradictory. And in many ways, that's really what Ford hit him up on. He said, hey, this guy's like talking two ways out of his mouth. It doesn't make any sense. And that attack works pretty well, at least in narrowing the lead. And then Carter gave that Playboy interview where he just was kind of a weird interview,
Yeah, I think a lot of it is Carter didn't realize that other people didn't understand the beliefs of baptism. Because Southern Baptists believe that everyone is a sinner in their heart, whether you enact it or not. So he was talking about, yeah, I've never had an affair, but I've definitely thought about having sex with other women. I mean, how could I not?
So he said, I've committed adultery in my heart.
Exactly. So he said that, and if you understood where he's coming from, then you would understand that based on what he believes, that is a completely reasonable thing to say. But if you're not familiar with Southern religion, that makes no sense at all, and it sounds fucking bizarre.
But not just that, you're doing this in Playboy.
Right, and it's also an interview in Playboy. And it's worth noting that even though Carter was very religious and very high-strung and got up at 5 a.m. every morning or 6 a.m. or whatever it was, and very religious in his personal life, he believed, one, in the separation of church and state very strongly. That was a traditional Baptist belief. And two, he always was cool with drinking, and he was never prudish about sex. So in that sense, he's a lot more like Gerald Ford than an evangelical Christian. So anyway,
yeah, he also.
Oh, go ahead.
No, he also had to. I say put up with. We should probably go ahead and quickly mention his illustrious brother right now, Billy Carter.
Yes. Also, it's interesting though. Another little thing about Jimmy before we get to the best Carter, but Jimmy also helped to get rid of blue laws while he was in Georgia government. So.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. All right, he's already a great man.
Yeah, no. I mean, anybody who's against stupid ass blue laws already has some cred at least.
So Billy Carter, sometimes called the best Carter, notorious for Billy Beer. Want to pull up a picture of that?
Oh yeah. Well, this is the redneck power pickup. Let's pull up some Billy Beer.
That's the model kit, right?
Yeah, he's got a model kit. Also, by the way, Billy Carter was not nearly as much of a redneck as he made himself out to be to make money. So he was playing this up hard because he knew reporters wanted him to be a redneck. So he would hang out with them and get drunk and really ham it up. But if you see him, he's clearly just some nerd pretending to be a huge redneck.
Yeah. I mean, he owned like a gas station in Plains, and of course he launched Billy Beer, which only lasted about a year. There it is, man.
I think part of why Jimmy was so annoyed with it is that Billy actually was a reasonably smart guy, but he played dumb to make money.
Yeah, which is smart. Come on.
Yeah, which actually is smart, because he made $500,000 in the 70s just for getting this Billy Beer contract and his model kit and all that. And apparently Billy Beer tastes so bad that when Billy would be seen with it in public, what he'd often do is go pour it out and then just put vodka in the can.
Or I read that he also drank Pabst instead of Billy, but the logo is amazing. I had this beer brewed up just for me. I think it's the best I've ever tasted, and I've tasted a lot.
Yeah.
I think you'll like it too.
Yeah, there we go.
Damn Billy Beer. God, I love the case where it's him just like having the beer at the cookout with the truck,
Yeah, so apparently it sort of strained the relationship between Jimmy and Billy, but there was never a big blow-up.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is Jimmy actually felt a little bit guilty about coming back to Plains and then running the family, so that way Billy didn't get to be the head of the family. And he was always kind of the other brother who was just around. So I think that's why he never confronted Billy about any of this, but he did privately make smart remarks about Billy's antics, and he found it annoying. But I mean, Billy did make a living off doing this, and
his gas station.
His gas station too probably helped. But imagine the $500,000 he made from Billy Beer and his model kit. Yeah. Made sure his gas station didn't have to be that profitable.
Did you pull a picture of the model kit?
Oh yeah, we got a picture up right now.
You do? Okay, I guess my thing's lagging over on this side. But anyway,
well, it might not show up. It might be an OBS issue, but.
Oh no, I got it. I caught up now. All right, there we go, man. Yeah, Billy Carter's redneck power pickup. I wonder how much this model kit goes for now.
I don't know. Oh, dude, I just noticed the plank bumper.
I never noticed that before.
Because otherwise it's just a paint job. I was going to be like, what's the specifically redneck part of this? But now I see it. Never mind. Okay, so that's all you got to do is just take off your bumper and put a 2x4 in the front of your truck. And now it's a redneck truck, I guess.
I don't care. I love Billy Carter, man.
Yeah, the sad thing about the Carter siblings, also one of Jimmy's sisters, not the one who's the spiritual advisor, but the other sister was part of a Harley Davidson gang. Or not really a gang, but a motorcycle club. And she had a tattoo of, I think, Mickey Mouse mowing a yard.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
I know, man. I love American kitsch, so this stuff's pretty awesome. But yeah, no, the 76 election is quite close. It's way closer than most people thought it was going to be. I think Carter only really beat Ford by about 1 million votes, and maybe 30 or 40, maybe 50 or so. I'm sorry, somewhere between their electoral votes. So not a great showing for Carter, especially considering he ran against Ford, whose approval rating was almost never above 50%.
Yeah, apparently what happened is Ford was gaining ground over the summer, especially after the Playboy interview, and then he made the notorious remark about the Soviets don't dominate Eastern Europe. And apparently Carter didn't catch that in the debate, but his advisors did, so he started to really hammer it later.
Yeah. And Carter, we'll see, Carter has an interesting relationship with the Soviet Union. I mean, you know me, I believe in the 13 keys of the presidency. I think Ford was doomed on arrival. I think it's something a bit miraculous that Ford actually made it as close as he did.
Yeah, actually, I'm of the opinion that Ford ran a better campaign than Carter. He just didn't really have a very good chance.
Yeah, no, he's in a really bad situation.
He was playing with house money, but still, he did better than he should have.
Yeah. But no, the other note is that before getting to the presidency, Carter really fits the mold of the idea of the disjunctive president, that is, one who's coming at the end of a political cycle and is trying to hold together an old coalition that is dying. And at the same time, they represent both the past and the future of their political party. And I think that Carter is, from when Skowronek was writing politics and the politics presidents make, I think Jimmy Carter was really who he was thinking of more than anybody else when he wrote about the disjunctive presidency. Well, that and Herbert Hoover, you know?
Oh, yeah. I don't mean to backtrack too much, but I just remembered another key factor in winning the primary, because remember, Jimmy technically only won a plurality, and then people sided with him afterwards for him to get the majority so there wouldn't be the brokered convention. Do you know who was the key figure in making sure that he was able to stave off a lot of challenges? And who was able to get him the black vote?
What, Jim Clyburn?
No, it was Martin Luther King Sr. Jimmy Carter and Martin Luther King's dad became very good friends in the 70s.
Oh, interesting. Didn't know that one. Okay.
Yeah, they did a rally together in Atlanta after Jimmy made some comment about how he wasn't opposed to places remaining ethnically pure if they chose to. So he said something very poorly phrased, and it made him look segregationist. So he had to save face by they called him Daddy King, and they held a rally together in Atlanta, and that made sure that Jimmy kept winning the black vote pretty handily in every state.
Mm. So, you want to go ahead and get into the early part of the Carter presidency?
Sure. I guess the first 2 years, somebody made the quip that a lot of presidents get a honeymoon. Jimmy didn't even get a one-night stand.
He did get a honeymoon, though. He did get a honeymoon. You want to answer? Do you think we should answer some super chats, though? We've actually had a few build up since then.
Yeah, we should probably do that. All right, where's the first one? Okay, we did Zach White. We got Levant. $5, thank you. Are Nixon and Carter alike in that they have principles beyond complete allegiance to global corporatism? They seem like ethical human beings. What do you think, Sean?
I, of course, would not call Nixon ethical, but I also don't see him as the great as the great Satan or something. You know, I don't think he was any less, or I don't think he was any less ethical than Lyndon Baines Johnson or even John F. Kennedy or Dwight D. Eisenhower or Harry Truman or Franklin Roosevelt, to be honest. I just think Nixon pissed off the wrong people and got caught. That's just my opinion on that, but I don't see Nixon as an ethical person. I do, however, think Nixon did have principles beyond allegiance to global corporatism. In fact, if anything, that probably got him into trouble. But yeah, I agree. I think that Carter was about as ethical as a politician could possibly be and achieve high office.
Yeah, I would say that Nixon might have more principles, but Carter had more ethics.
I could see that.
Because Nixon seems to have a more clear goal of what he wants to do. Although, I mean, Carter has his goals, he just doesn't articulate them particularly well.
Also, Carter's goals are a little more technocratic.
Yes, whereas I think Nixon's thinking on a grander scale about America's place in the world, and Carter is thinking more about energy policy as an engineering problem. So he's thinking of it more like a Secretary of Energy than like a president.
Yeah, very good point to say about the engineering thing, which is also why when Skronik does mention this disjunctive president idea, he says that they see that they treat the presidency like they're an engineer to it, or a Mr. Fix-It, if you will. What's our next one?
Our next one is from J. Kelsey55 for $5. Thank you. How long until Barron Trump resumes control of the federal government? This meaning the son, Barron Trump.
Yeah, the one who some of his pictures got leaked a few years ago or something. He drew pictures of women with large breasts or something. It's ridiculous.
Well, his son is probably like 6'8" or 9.
How long until Barron Trump becomes president? What you thinking? 30, 40 years?
Well, I don't know. I mean, yeah, he can be eligible in about 30 years. That makes sense. That could happen.
Yeah, sure. I'll give it 30 years. By that time, we'll be in the Road Warrior phase anyway.
Yeah, Barron Trump will come out wearing a bulletproof vest, but with spikes added to the shoulders for dramatic effect. And then he'll pull the Camacho. He'll pull out a gun in the House of Representatives and fire it in the air to call the meeting to order.
All right.
Jay Kelsey, 55. Another super chat. Thank you. I want to hear Sean say, Byzantines or Romans?
That for me to say such a falsehood would take more than $10, sir.
Well, oh man, yeah, Sean just being rude to the listeners.
Well, I'm just joking with you, man. Byzantines are. We're not even here for that right now.
Yeah. Byzantines. Also, probably part 5 of Basil this coming week. We'll see, though.
Yeah, I just listened to part 4 today. You made some good points about the eye gouging part, where that probably really wasn't decisive in winning the campaign, but we remember it because it is such a noteworthy atrocity.
Yeah, it also might not have even been the first time he did that. We don't really know because we have an 11-year gap in the record.
Yeah, frustrating, huh?
Yeah, not as frustrating as the gap between with Seleucus's career, where he's just riding off into the desert to start a revolt. Next thing we know, he's got his own empire.
Oh God, that's awful! Oh my God.
Yeah, no, that whole part of Diodorus is missing. We know that Antigonus fought a war against Seleucus. Seleucus had a bunch of allies, and Ptolemy and some of the others. They all left Seleucus on his own by making peace. So basically Antigonus is fighting a revolt, and somehow Seleucus still won independence and took a lot of territory with him. And we don't know how. So that's very frustrating. Next super chat comes to us from Jack Griffin for $5. Thank you, sir. Could you guys do a tier ranking of the first Punic War? It's much less discussed than the second. Anyways, thanks for the awesome videos. Well, thank you, Jack. And yes, a First Punic War tier ranking video is definitely a possibility and something that I'm down to do at some point.
I know very little. I probably wouldn't be able to add much except for the part with the sacred chickens.
Yeah. For that,
I'm all but the sacred chickens.
Yeah, basically just read Polybius. He writes a fair amount about the First Punic War.
Okay.
Let's see. Scrolling down, scrolling down.
Might be it, actually. Okay. Oh.
Where is the next?
Oh wait, we just got one.
Okay. Slatternly Skaghalter for $4.99. Thank you, sir. Awesome work. Boiled peanuts, good. Boiled peanuts are good.
I usually go with the honey roasted, but yes, boiled peanuts are good. That is true.
Oh, yeah, there's one I missed. Normac Cameron for $5. America in 30 years will look like the Russian Federation in 1993. It's funny because it's true.
Yeah, there's a possibility of that in some ways, but I think we'll get into some discussion of that when we get to the let's do some Cold War stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, Russian Federation in 1993. If you mean like equivalent of Estonia and Latvia are going to split off, you know. But anyway, let's go ahead and go into the first few years of the Carter presidency. His inauguration's interesting. He walked to the White House.
Yes.
And yeah, and on his first day, he pardoned all draft dodgers, a move that Ford had already kind of started to begin with. It should be noted, in his first few months as president, he had 75% approval rating, which I have to say, I haven't seen that for any president in my lifetime, except for that Bush post 9/11 stuff.
Yes, I remember that. That was a unique time. I think he had that approval rating for about a year.
No, he held it for a long, long time, man. Two other little fun notes about Carter. He did not send his kids to a private school, they went to public school.
Yes.
And he banned the playing of Hail to the Chief.
That, and for his inaugural ball and for all the events, he made sure that the maximum ticket price was no more than $25. That way, if you wanted to go, you could. And he also just really tried to be more accessible. Like the whole walk from the Capitol to the White House. Apparently, no other president has ever made the entire walk. And it was to show an openness. He said it was supposed to symbolize the weaken or the lessening of the imperial presidency. So he's supposed to be more a man of the people than, say, Nixon.
Yes. I mean, Nixon being detached. And in some ways, that's also a continuation of Ford in so much as, you know, Ford would, even when he was like almost shot twice, you know, once by the Manson family member, he still was like, I'm still out in the motorcade, right? And, you know, it was raining that one time, and Ford still wanted to show up for the people there, even in the rain. And I believe that both Ford and Carter were really trying to downplay that imperial presidency thing. You know, Carter taking it to another level, which is once again why I think Carter is in many ways a continuation of the Ford presidency, as we'll see. You know.
Yeah, I mean they're not that different, really, when you really boil it down.
So, what is the first issue of the first 2 years of the Carter presidency you want to talk about?
Well,
like you want to talk about staffing or
let's
the
talk
energy
about staffing
stuff
first. Carter apparently took a lot of flack in the press for bringing in a lot of Georgians.
It's weird. He took flack for bringing in both insiders and outsiders. The outsiders being guys like Jody Powell and Hamilton Jordan, then insiders like Cyrus Vance and who's that guy's name? Brzezinski. Yeah, which was like, there's this tendency to have a Secretary of State and a National Security Advisor who are essentially at odds, and some of this you could trace back to Nixon. You know, but the thing with Nixon is that Nixon did not trust the State Department. That was a long Republican thing about thinking the State Department had been compromised during the Cold War. That was full of commies. Okay, there was some communist infiltration, but some of that was overstated. More importantly, there's a view that the State Department had somehow lost China, which that was total bunk. But regardless, Nixon, to bypass the State Department, emphasizes Kissinger and personal diplomacy. The issue here is that Brzezinski and Vance have very different views on foreign policy. So these two apparently would bicker in public as well. And so he brings in his mix of both outsiders and insiders. Seems like it annoyed people who were hoping for more of either group.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else you want to say about any of the people in the staff?
Well, one thing I found interesting is he did not name a chief of staff, but Hamilton Jordan basically did the job anyway.
Yeah. No, I read about that. They both Powell and Jordan turned down the offer, although Jordan essentially does the work of it anyway. But this is also as a way to make the president more accessible, which once again is a departure from Nixon, because to get to Nixon, you had to go through Haldeman and Ehrlichman. He wants to be the accessible president, which is really weird because his relations with Congress are very, very cold. Part of that is because apparently he threatened Congress and said that if they wouldn't pass certain things he wanted to do, he would simply rally the people and apply populist pressure, kind of like what Bernie Sanders was threatening to do, which is a very weird thing because to do that, you would have to be a much more charismatic and forceful personality than Carter. I think it's interesting because Carter ran this populist candidacy and he could pull it off to a degree, but I don't think he could pull it off in the way where you rally the people to pressure Congress. But Congress didn't like the idea of being told that to begin with, that they were going to get threatened,
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I think you're right. I don't think Carter would have been able to rally a bunch of support for some hyper-technocratic fuel standards and get people to march on Washington over that.
Yeah. So the list of stuff I have to do is to go over energy,
yes,
foreign policy, and and a little bit about deregulation. So energy, foreign policy, deregulation. Do you have any other ones you want to add to that list for the first 2 years?
No. That seems like a pretty good list of at least the important things.
Okay, well, you pick the first one to talk about in that list of 3.
I will take deregulation for 100, Sean.
This is the one that I read the least about. I read the most about foreign policy. But I know that in terms of deregulation, he is going to do deregulation involving banks, the airplane industry, and also beer. Now, the banking one I know very little about. I hope you've read something about that. I can say that some of the stuff he did with airplanes led to a reduction in plane tickets, to an expansion of air travel. How good or bad that is, I'll leave up to you, since, when people tell me, like, I'm into green energy, and then I'm like, how many times have you flown a jet plane? Because if you've crossed the country once, you've already negated all of your gains. But as far as beer deregulation goes, I mean, the craft beer industry, it's going to take some decades after this, but your first American craft brewery started opening up post-Carter presidency because he did certain deregulations that made it harder for you to open up a microbrewery. One of your first ones, of course, being the Boston Beer Company, which makes Samuel Adams beer. So it didn't happen right away, but you can already start to see that happening through the 1980s and then really accelerating in the, I'd say, the mid to late aughts, especially late aughts,
And this really just makes me feel bad for Billy Carter, though, because the one thing he had on Jimmy is he was seen as the guy who was the fun, beer-drinking dude. And then, in the long run, Jimmy Carter is indirectly responsible for beer that you can actually drink. So he even took that away from Billy.
Well, beer was a wasteland in the 70s, too, in America. I mean, you had, I think in the 1970s, there was not a single place in America where they made porter beer. Not a single one. That's one of my favorite styles anyway. Now, I don't drink beer. Yeah, so in the 70s, if you were going to drink porter beer, it had to be some kind of import from Britain or something. Nobody was making it domestically. So if I owned a microbrewery, if I was involved in that world, I would have like some kind of Jimmy Carter beer. Not I mean a Billy Beer and a Jimmy Beer. Okay, just saying. All right, because of him he's a big reason why we have what we have today on that front. But what more can you say about the other deregulation? Because that's about all I've got.
Well, I mean, obviously the microbrewery one is the one that people hold up as, yeah, this was actually a good one. The airline one and the truck one, I don't know all that much about. I do know, like you said, that people claim airline prices went down and also that it became possible to fly to more places. So different airlines now had more permission to go to different airports. So all of that sounds good. I'm not sure if there's a downside. I didn't really look too much into that.
Outside of environmental concerns,
Yeah.
no. I mean, two things you do notice that tourism within America really is going to pick up post Carter, and a lot of it's going to have to do with cheaper air flights.
So with the trucking deregulation, I'm going on a limb a little bit here. I didn't have a lot of time to look this up, but from what I understand, the selling point for the people who defend it is that it reduced the cost of goods. By reducing the price of trucking, the cost of this, though, was paid for by truckers. In the 70s, trucking was a very profitable job. And now it's not so much that. The trucking industry and then the Teamsters have weakened considerably, and trucking companies are free to hire people as contractors, pay them inadequate wages, and not give them benefits. And all of that started with the deregulation in the Carter years. So that one, I would say, yeah, I don't think they should talk about that as an accomplishment. It's just my opinion.
Sounds like a break even.
At best, yeah. So, another deregulation, you talk about banks. I'm not super familiar with what Carter did in regard to banking, but just based on how things have gone, I'm going to guess not a good idea.
Well, I had this one theory, though, about this with Ford and Carter. The deregulation I've read that they've done, mixed bag. Like the trucking one, mixed bag. Get even. Saying even might be a little overstating it. The beer one, of course, is well thought of. Some of the stuff Ford actually did make sense.
Yeah.
Because let's face it, I mean, regulations are like anything else. You got good ones, you got bad ones. It's really when you get into Reagan, and then especially in the Clinton years, that they're essentially getting rid of regulations that are actually vital, and that's going to lead to disaster in the last 20 years, essentially. So I actually don't like Ford and Carter represent a trend towards deregulation that is going to be bad later on. For them, it's actually not that bad, really, or it's a mixed bag, debatably.
Yeah, I mean, they're not deregulating anything too major, so this is not, say, taking away Glass-Steagall like Bill Clinton did in 1999.
Yeah. And should we note that in some ways, Carter's introducing new regulations, of course, with the Department of Education, and doesn't he found the Department of Energy as well?
Yes, he founds two major departments.
Yeah. So he is also adding on regulations as well. So Carter would not view himself as a deregulator so much as somebody who wanted to provide smart government and actually means it, not a code word for let's get rid of Glass-Steagall.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter, he did sometimes downsize things. As governor of Georgia, he actually cut a lot of stuff out of the government. But it wasn't because he was trying to reduce the role of government. He was just trying to eliminate things he saw as wasteful.
Yeah. Always a big thing for him was what they called the pork barrel spending, if you will, the graft. He was a anti-corruption guy through his entire career.
Yes. And that's one of the other reasons he had trouble sometimes getting along with people in Congress, because they expected some kickbacks. And Jimmy Carter, I guess, eventually got to the point where he realized it was necessary, but he would never do the deal himself. He'd let Hamilton Jordan or somebody go and approve it without his knowledge.
So, do you want to get into foreign policy?
Sure. Let's go abroad.
Yeah. Let's go abroad. There's really three things to discuss here. One is going to be Carter represents something of a break in American foreign policy, but also a bit of its hypocrisy as well. So he was really big on what he called human rights and how he defined them. In fact, he mentioned that quite a bit in his farewell address. And to that effort, Carter was a critic of the American practice, which had essentially been what we've been doing since Harry Truman, of saying, like, look, we know you're a murderous psycho dictator, but you're not with the commies. Here's your guns. You know? And, you know, while this was a practice that was not followed through consistently, it was followed consistently, but it wasn't followed with every country. But Carter in particular was very, very critical of this and believed that if America was going to win the Cold War and the world was going to be better, that America could not afford to back such dictators. So, for instance, he's going to cut aid to Ethiopia, Argentina, El Salvador, and most notably Chile. You know, Chile, of course, had the coup with Pinochet, which had the blessing of Kissinger. So once again, another rebuke to Nixon. That doesn't mean Carter is going to cut all of the aid, right?
Right.
An example of that, the biggest example is, of course, going to be Iran. Now, Iran is not as oppressive as other places, it must be said, and the Shah of Iran himself saw himself as a modernizer of Iran and a westernizer. But he's a, mildly oppressive one, if you will, and Carter is still going to provide him with military aid and equipment. In fact, the Iranians get the F-14.
They do. They get, I think it was about 20 F-14 Tomcats.
Yeah, which is kind of nuts because we didn't really export that to many countries.
I think they're the only people who got it as an export.
Only guys, right. So, yeah, we hoarded the F-14 because we know Maverick needs it,
Yeah, because there's an Iranian Maverick, too. Little known fact. The Farsi Tom Cruise. Farsi-speaking
in some ways,
Tom Cruise.
Oh, what's up? Sorry?
Yeah, there's a Farsi-speaking Tom Cruise out there.
Somewhere, man. He downed about 50 Iraqi jets in the 80s, right? But no, the thing about this is you see this playing out in foreign policy in America today, and I think Carter represents this shift in American foreign policy where you're going away from the we have to back you no matter what, which Reagan does some of that as well, but even Reagan, towards the end of his term, in his presidency, is, dialing back from it. And then you really see with Bush and Clinton. But it doesn't mean we don't back dictators. It just means we don't back them as broadly as we did previously. And you see that with America even today. A variety of countries will denounce and say we can't do this because of human rights violations, and other ones we're going to give a pass because either they are vital allies or, more importantly, because they're very important for our economy.
Right.
So I really view I do view Carter as signifying that shift in American foreign policy. He's also wants to win over Latin America, and that leads, of course, to the Panama Canal Treaty. This was blasted heavily at the time, was not popular. It barely got through Congress, and this is really one of the big ones Ronald Reagan was yelling about at the time. Honestly, it worked out. It created goodwill in Central America. We could make the argument that Carter didn't necessarily sell it as well as he could have, but what Carter wasn't understanding was that Americans at this time didn't actually want a retreat from world affairs. They wanted America to have an aggressive, muscular foreign policy, but not a stupid one. Carter perceived that what Carter was doing was perceived as retreat, if you will, which is very much not true, as we're going to see when we get to the other half of his presidency with Afghanistan. But at any rate, though, the other big one is going to be the subject of détente. Now, this is a big one. Détente had become a dirty word by this time. Ford and Kissinger had essentially tried to follow the détente policy, but had not had quite so much success. In the case of Carter, he is going to favor China gradually more and more until by 1979, relations are actually normalized between China and America. Now, His problem is that he has Vance and Brzezinski. Vance favors détente with the Soviet Union. Brzezinski does not. Okay? In efforts, though, Carter tries to put through SALT II, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. That was supposed to limit the number of nuclear weapons at 2,000 per side. This treaty has a hard time going through Congress and eventually will be retracted by Carter himself. That is when the Soviets invade Afghanistan. So what you really see in the Carter years is détente collapses. Carter doesn't really... He's not a kind of man who can play two sides off each other effectively. And as his presidency goes on, he favors Brzezinski over Vance. And with that, détente is over. That means we're going to have the relation with the Soviet Union once again take a turn for the worse. It should also be noted, though, that while Nixon goes to China, and it, of course, is a big deal, but Carter is really where you start to get this weird China, I don't want to say alliance, but this like kind of like China-America understanding that in many ways has continued to this day. I would not say that Nixon and Ford really count for that. Both of them were more or less just trying to, play off the Chinese so they get concessions from the Russians. Whereas with Carter, you see him going like, we can get some deals with the Russians, but actually we'd rather be friends with China. Which once again goes back to the whole thing where Carter's saying like, détente with the Soviet Union's a bad idea because they're oppressive and we're not going to give money to Chile and Egypt. But, Iran and China are okay. I mean, yeah, it's seriously though. I as much as I detest I detest a lot about American foreign policy in particular, and that Cold War, like, we'll back any dictator. Yeah, it's detestable, but I give it points for being consistent and not two-faced, as it is today. But I get it. I don't know.
We're spreading freedom. We got to protect the rights of women in Afghanistan. Therefore, we can't leave.
Yeah, I hate that. I hate morality in foreign policy. I despise it. I'm all for realpolitik all the way. Nations are bullies, and they are not to be trusted. And this injecting morality into it just makes relations tense when really you should just be dealing with interests, material interests. But anyway.
I think realpolitik is how it actually works, and then the moralizing is just a bunch of bullshit used as a smokescreen.
I think this is what it is. The moralizing, I don't doubt that it's important and it's there. And you see it in a lot of soft power stuff. But when push comes to shove, it's about the money. In Chile, Ethiopia, and Argentina, we're not exporting a ton of oil to America the way Iran was. And allying with China was a way to weaken the Soviets. Allying with Chile, Ethiopia, and Argentina doesn't weaken the Soviets that much. At any rate, though, I will briefly mention Carter's greatest achievement in many people's opinions, the Camp David Accords of 1978. You had Menachem Begum of Israel, Anwar Sadat of Egypt. These men were already making peaceful gestures, but no agreements could be made. Carter essentially insisted they come to Camp David, or they would have personal talks. Now, in some ways, this is a stroke of genius. Carter is actually able to moderate between the two. The talks almost broke down several times. But this also represents something of Carter embracing the Nixon way of foreign policy. This is some stuff Nixon would do, right? Like, we're going to have talks in rooms where the press isn't around. Like for instance, Kissinger had done, to open China up, Kissinger went on a secret mission to China. It's all very like espionage spy stuff. And this isn't quite that, but this is Carter in many ways saying that we are going to, that the Nixon way of foreign policy, of personal deal making is effective. And it's one of his finest moments. You got any comments?
No, I mean, I think you summed it up pretty well.
Yeah. No, I would say that with the Camp David Accords, of course, what they represent is that Egypt gets the Sinai Peninsula back. Egypt, in turn, recognizes Israel, I believe, being the first Arab country to do so.
And the importance, of course, is that any coalition against Israel, which is going to have any chance in hell, had to include Egypt. because they were the only ones with enough heavy metal in their army to really make it a fight.
Exactly, and of course, one of the things that's playing a part here is that, on the one hand, Sadat is going to expel the Soviets, so he's moving away from the Soviet orbit, which Nasser had embraced. At the same time, Israel had, the Yom Kippur War had come as a bit of a shock. Now, that war we can get into the end. I read about it years ago. That might be worth doing a whole discussion on, because that's a very weird, complicated war in many ways. But it should be noted that with the Yom Kippur War, Israel's starting to think that, we can keep fighting, but one of these days it might be curtains for us. So maybe it's time to make a deal. So no, this is a big deal. And you can kind of see the continuation of this policy all the way until today, when, towards the Trump presidency's last few months, they get a bunch of other countries to recognize Israel. At this point, if you are a Palestinian activist, considering that and Israel's defense missile system, you probably think you're fucked, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably so. Anyways, that's the overall stuff of the Carter foreign policy. He represents a shift away from détente, a shift towards a foreign policy that attempts to be moral, but yet still is going to be making deals with China and, of course, giving very heavy support to Iran. And at the same time, he reaffirms the value of personal diplomacy. Something a lot of our presidents could probably learn from. But anyway, so foreign policy-wise, I think Carter's been viewed more positively in the long run. He was viewed a bit more negatively at that time for a variety of reasons. But I believe foreign policy was one of Carter's stronger suits, if you will.
I'm inclined to agree. He didn't get us in any major wars, so he's got that going for him. I think there was somebody who said, I don't know how true this is, I guess it doesn't take into account any covert ops, but Carter is the only president of the post-war period who did not drop bombs on anybody.
I have heard that before, and I believe it is accurate. But that really became a Reagan, but especially a Clinton thing. Because I remember Clinton. I'm not saying that. Reagan did some stuff that was like Libya, right? But I just remembered, Bill Clinton one day would just be randomly bombing Iraq, right? I feel like in the Clinton years, I think the Clinton years is when that really got normalized. Of course, Bush and Reagan did some of it too, but one could always say in that context that it was, say, a terrorist thing or something to do with the Cold War. By the time you get to Clinton, you just kind of feel like it's a vapid exercise of power, But anyway, what was it called? Operation Desert Fox, you said?
I think it was in 1998. I'm just showing Saddam who the man is.
You do a good Clinton, man. So, wait, did they have, Rommel written on the bombs or something?
I don't know, but I just remember that from watching the news back then, and I recognized it as Rommel because I knew a little bit of history by then, and I thought that was kind of a neat reference. Although I guess pretty obvious reference since we're talking about desert warfare and referencing a desert general, but still.
I will say, though, American operation names got a lot more sucky with the Bush years, because you had Desert Fox, Desert Storm, right?
Right.
What was the name for Grenada? That was a pretty cool one too. But now they have names like Iraqi Freedom, and I'm like, this is lame. I prefer the best operation. The best operation name ever, though, was the World War II invasion, World War II landings in Rangoon, Operation Dracula.
Nice.
Yeah, that's a badass name, Operation Dracula.
Yeah, all the ones with Bush emphasized freedom because he was the absolute worst about using that moralizing rhetoric to justify war.
Yeah.
Operation, we're going to bring them freedom.
I want to get into do you want to get into energy?
Sure. Let's talk about probably Carter's. I would say if he chose an issue to be remembered for, would probably be energy. I think this is where his real passion was.
And in some ways, it's the issue that I would say broke the presidency. in many ways, or at least cause the long-term damage. The Iranian hostage crisis is really going to break it. But yeah. So what you got for energy?
So, when Jimmy Carter came to office, oil prices were high, and there was a lot of inflation as well. So Carter, one of his goals was to try to make America energy independent. He had always been a conservationist, but he very much united the idea of protecting the environment, something that Nixon and Ford had started. He took that idea and went with it, and also went with the idea of limiting use. So he talked a lot about personal austerity and cutting back and mandating efficiency standards. So this was something that wasn't super popular because it was effectively a politician. Do what?
Carpooling. He's like, everybody should carpool.
Yes, I mean, he's on TV and he's basically telling you to eat your vegetables. He's saying, okay, guys, no, we got to do less consumption. We need TVs that use less energy. Your cars need to get better mileage. You need to use them less. Turn your thermostat back. You don't have to be perfectly warm or cool. We got to save energy. We got to break away from OPEC. And the way to do that is to use less energy. And also we need to use more renewables. So he put a bunch of money into solar. And the first solar panels really started to come out. He put some of the early ones on the White House, famously, as a symbol. And he also tried to do energy conservation even at his inauguration. So in 1976, he set up a booth that was heated by renewables. And at this time, the technology was not super reliable. And so the heat wasn't working well. And an elderly Omar Bradley was there complaining about it.
Bradley. Oh, God.
Yeah, Bradley was about 84 at this time and in a wheelchair. And there was very little heat on Inauguration Day because the solar panels weren't working too well. Anyway, so Carter really got the ball rolling on solar energy, which at this point has become very reliable and efficient, but of course in its early years, not so much. He was also very pro-nuclear. As a guy who had worked with reactors, he actually had been called to Canada to deal with the reactor meltdown. He had gone into the Corps to fix it, and he's never had cancer, to the best of my knowledge, at least not until he's in his 90s. So he thought it wasn't really that big of a risk. And he
was all for nuclear until 3 Mile Island.
Yes, I mean, Carter, at least at this time, was a huge advocate of nuclear energy.
Yeah.
So he wanted to combine that with renewables, so hydro, etc. Although he was against damming unnecessarily, because he thought that it destroyed the ecological function of rivers and also their recreational use. So he's not a big fan of hydro, actually, but every other renewable source he was a big fan of. Wind, solar, especially. And he also expanded natural gas, because partly just because he had to, but also it is cleaner than oil or coal. And as a part of this grand strategy, he created the Department of Energy. And another part of this was that he set very high standards that he expected to come into play by 1995 or so. Let me see if I've got those written down here, because they're pretty interesting. So, his goal was to have 18 miles per gallon immediately, have hybrid cars by the early 80s. We didn't get those until, 2005? And to have a standard mile per gallon in a commercial vehicle of, do you want to guess what it would be by 1995, Sean?
Wait, what was the question again? Sorry.
So, Carter, what do you think was Carter's goal for 1995 in terms of the average fuel efficiency in a car?
30 miles to the gallon.
Try 48.
Holy hell.
And we're still not close to that. Actually, the Biden administration set a new goal for 2025, which will be just a mere 40. And they were talked down from going to 54. So this was after two compromises, the Biden administration settled on 40. And this is 30 years after the fact, or will be by the time we get to 2025.
Well, I mentioned him having the bad relationship with Congress. This energy bill, which was shepherded through the House by Tip O'Neill, who Carter had a decent enough relationship with, but he had a bad relationship with Byrd, Robert Byrd, who was the Senate Majority Leader. And the bill got watered down quite a bit, I read.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, apparently, Tip O'Neill did not like Hamilton Jordan.
Yeah, that's correct. He did not like him. The other thing to note, too, is Carter was telling Congress, like, I'll bring popular pressure on you. Well, they looked at the ratings for it and realized that this energy bill didn't have popular support. I mean, Carter pushed it through because this was in his first year of his presidency, and it's still when he has some high approval rating in his political capital, but there was not some popular groundswell because, like you say, he's telling people to eat their vegetables and they don't want to. This is, I mean, it's a bit harder for us to understand because, I mean, not that we're not living opulent, over the top lives, historically speaking, because we are, but people this time really are. I mean, what are you going to tell older people who lived through the Depression? They already lived through the Depression. They don't want to live through, having to like cut back. Same thing, And then you got the bunch of boomers. I mean, hell, Nixon had the boomers pegged. He said they don't care about dying, about us blowing up people in Vietnam. They just don't want to go die because they're too busy wanting sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I mean, this is a very indulgent culture. And I'd say, America 70s through 90s is about, actually 70s all the way to the aughts, or 60s all the way to the aughts, is about the most indulgent the nation's ever been, really.
Yeah, also, speaking of Carter and boomers, apparently one of his lifelong challenges has been trying to understand his own kids, who, of course, are boomers.
Yeah, this is something worth mentioning. I'll say this. The people I knew who had the worst stuff to say about Carter were almost all boomers.
Yeah, and apparently Carter once said in the 90s when his grandkids started to graduate from college, I don't really get my kids, and I don't care too much what they think of me, but I am concerned what my grandkids think of me. So Carter is literally giving up on boomers. No joke. Even the ones that he created.
He saw the light before most of us did. I mean, well, I was preaching anti-boomer stuff back in 2008, but I mean, Carter saw the light way before the rest of us.
Yeah, I mean, I guess too, Carter's not the kind of guy that want to talk about his feelings too much unless it's with Rosalind, and they're obviously extremely close. But yeah, otherwise, you're not going to have a warm and fuzzy sit down with Jimmy Carter or talk about, your personal feelings. So he has been consistent in butting heads with boomers. I think that's part of why he and Bill Clinton always had a tense relationship, even when he first met Bill when he was governor of Georgia.
Oh, he met Bill Clinton when he was governor, huh? Okay.
Yeah, so Jimmy traveled to Arkansas to campaign for him when Bill was first running for Congress. I believe he lost that race. And he was super pissed off because Bill Clinton was an hour late. So he's supposed to be there at 5 a.m. Bill only got up around 6.
Oh, God, that sounds like Bill.
Well, it also sounds like Jimmy, though, because Jimmy was obsessed with punctuality. And he also always instructed his tour bus to leave exactly on time, regardless of who was on the bus. And he does that to his fucking family on vacation, by the way. It's not just something he does to strangers or the press. And this also happened to Hunter S. Thompson once, and he got super pissed about it. But
all right, I gotta say this: I'm not as punctual as Jimmy Carter in that regard. I mean, at least the pressure I put on others or even myself. I'm pretty damn punctual, so I got sympathy. Okay.
Well, yeah. I feel like if I were to tell you, hey Sean, I'm gonna be 5 minutes late because I got to do this, you'd be like, well, okay, just hurry the fuck up. But you wouldn't just leave the curb. Jimmy Carter would and does. So yeah, Bill Clinton's a little bit more laid back in that regard. And basically Carter, when he met Clinton, said something to the effect of, okay, I'm not sure that I like this guy, but I do think he's got some talent and I can see him going places.
Yeah.
So anyway.
So we're going to get to do you want to get into the midterms real quick and then the what happens in 79 when the essentially the shithouse goes up in flames?
Yeah, the 1978 midterms, which if I had to peg a precise moment when the neoliberal era begins, would actually be the 78 midterms.
Now, why is that exactly?
So there's a major Supreme Court case in 1978. I cannot remember the name of it right offhand, but combined with the earlier cases in the 70s, including Buckley v. Vallejo, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, this one
Yeah.
started to open the floodgates of corporate money into elections. And in 1978, this meant that more corporate candidates did really well because now they're way more well funded than ever. And this was the first election that was the case. And now corporations are outspending unions by a considerable margin, not just by a decent amount, but now they're outspending them at least 3 or 4 to 1, and it'll only balloon from there. And that's
So here's
partly when Carter starts to do more deregulation in the second half of his term because he's now under a lot more pressure from business.
Mm.
But so
no.
the 78 midterms. Let's see if we can find the results here.
Oh, and I looked them up ahead of time. They're really not that bad for the Democrats. They lose 15 seats in the House and 3 Senate seats. In terms of midterms, that's kind of minor.
Yeah, it's
right?
about standard, I would say. I mean, you expect to take losses during the first midterm of your first term.
I wouldn't say that's standard anymore. I believe that because Formasano said this, that he believed we were entering an era of anti-party feeling. He said that in 2009. And I believe that means that midterms for America, and we've really since the 90s, are very extreme. And we've had so many massive House changeovers since 1994. Now, to be fair to this, you had the Watergate stuff in '74. The Republicans you'd had some ones that were pretty rough, but this one's pretty minor, I'd say. Like Reagan lost more in his first term. Clinton lost way more. Okay, Bush gained some. That's unusual though. That's a different circumstance. Obama, Trump, Johnson lost a bunch of seats in 1966. So this is relatively minor. And from what I read, this apparently the fact the losses were so few and they still had comfortable majorities, especially in the House, meant that they didn't panic. They thought, okay, we're looking good. Like they're leaving 1978 and thinking, okay, we've done the Camp David Accords, midterms we didn't lose a whole lot. We're coasting to re-election in 1980. Well, that's going to change. So, 1979, we have a series of crises here. I think the first one to really start off with, of course, is going to be Iran. So, what do you want to say about that?
Well, I have seen the movie Argo, so I know how that went. And I know that Jimmy Carter is of the opinion to this day that had he advertised the arrangement that he made to get the hostages out of Iran, that he would have won a second term.
Yes, possibly so. However, the Iran thing is not just a bloody nose to American prestige with the flag being burned and the hostages being taken. It should be noted that the capture of those hostages, it wasn't because of the revolution per se. It's because he let the Shah come to America.
Yeah, and then he visited the White House, which was a huge mistake because it's basically... I mean, obviously the Shah originally was installed by the CIA in 1953 and then overthrown by the Ayatollah in 1979. And it was kind of contrary to Carter's... I wouldn't call him a non-interventionist necessarily, but certainly he was a much less of an interventionist than his predecessors and successors. So it was a fairly hypocritical move to have the Shah visit the White House, and to the revolutionaries it indicated that America would reimpose the Shah. So it was a huge blunder on Carter's part, which I guess goes back to him not quite understanding how people work sometimes.
Yeah, there may have been a personal element to it insofar as I know that he saw the Shah. I think he also misread the Shah in that regard. He saw the Shah of Iran as a modernizer, and the Shah, to be fair, was a technocrat too. You know. And
Yes.
I did watch this one thing of like years back where you had Carter like toasting the Shah of Iran when he visited the country. You know, and you can you're looking at this thing and you're like, well, don't you know what this guy does? I mean, all right, granted, he's not like, I mean, he's not the second coming of Hitler here, but you get my drift. Um, the oil from Iran is not coming in, so the oil prices increase. Carter's approval rating dips below 30%, and now inflation is back. The inflation rate, I think, was at 12% at a certain point. I understand, Ford had made beating inflation a big deal. So when Ford left, Ford's like, hey, we think we have inflation under control. And now it's back? I mean, it's like that thing in the horror movie when the axe murderer comes back after you've like thrown out of an airplane, right?
Whip inflation now.
Yes. Win. And of course, this comes with the crisis of confidence speech known as the malaise speech. Have you watched this thing before?
I have not, but I do know that Jimmy Carter never actually said the word malaise in the speech.
Did not. That's sometimes technically referred to. It's better, more accurately referred to as crisis of confidence. But I understand the malaise idea was a popular word at the time. Now Carter had to give the speech, had consulted with Christopher Lasch, who had written The Culture of Narcissism. I believe Christopher Lasch is one of the finest American thinkers and historians of the last 40, 50 years. And many of his predictions and prognosis have essentially come true since he died. So I recommend everybody read Christopher Lasch. Agree or disagree with him, he's a heavyweight. But that said, you don't read Christopher Lasch to rally the country. But this is Carter for you. He has this. He has these ideals about modesty and not spending as much. Trying to cut back on your energy use, things that people are just not into at this point. And the speech, I have very mixed feelings about. A fun fact: Walter Mondale told him not to do it, but he did anyway. In some ways, it's a good speech in that Carter was being honest with people and leveling with them. But at the same time, he's not a great public speaker, and he does come off as weak. So I think there was a way for him to have done a similar speech, but it had to be in a certain style that he was not capable of doing. And this caused his approval rating to dip even further. Although, fun fact about it, apparently, in the initial few days afterwards, his approval rating saw a small increase. And then it was like suddenly people thought about it and realized, oh no, this speech sucks.
I mean, maybe just because it came across as so different. At first, they were thinking, well, maybe this was actually brilliant. I just got to think about it more.
Well, I think Carter lacked a Franklin Roosevelt touch, because Franklin Roosevelt could. I mean, he did the whole. Because Carter maybe was trying to copy that whole fireside chat style, right?
Yeah.
And he just can't do it. He can't do it. He's not chummy. And, FDR is the kind of guy who could tell you, like, yeah, this is going to be hard, but don't worry, we're going to pull through. We're Americans. We're going to do this. Carter just didn't give that off.
Although apparently Carter's appearance in his fireside chats did win approval because he kind of dressed like Mr. Rogers when he did them. And people were into that back then.
The first few. The first few of those things he did like that, they worked. I'm talking about when you get to this one, it doesn't. And he does look lost and overwhelmed.
I feel like the malaise speech idea really could have worked had he marketed it as, we have to save energy now so we can use energy recklessly later once we have a much more efficient energy grid. I feel like if there was candy at the end of the rainbow, a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, then maybe people would have actually gone for this. But he didn't understand you actually have to have a carrot to go along with the stick.
No, he didn't. That's not his style. He's like, no, you got to work hard and be frugal.
Yeah.
And then you, of course, have Operation Eagle Claw, which Cyrus Vance was not asked about. So this is a whole debacle. Eagle Claw is a military failure. It's an attempt to rescue the hostages. They get lost in a sandstorm, and some helicopters are lost. And then at the same time, Vance, who's been openly feuding with Brzezinski, resigns. So this is a fiasco. You got any notes you want to say about Operation Eagle Claw?
Well, it's probably the coolest name for a failed operation that I can think of.
What about Operation Barbarossa?
I mean, that's okay, but Barbarossa lasted a lot longer and probably had more success than Eagle Claw.
Yeah, around this time, too, you have the Jimmy Carter rabbit incident. You know about this?
No.
Okay, so all right, so just a little bit of personal background. My dad absolutely hated Jimmy Carter. All right, I mean, he hated Lyndon Johnson too, but he saw Lyndon Johnson as being like a shrewd politician. He thought Carter was just a feeble, pathetic man. All right, so he loathed this guy, and my dad harped on about the killer rabbit incident, as he called it. All right? And what it was is Jimmy Carter was at Plains in 1979, and he was just fishing, and there was some big kind of jackrabbit, or they call it a swamp rabbit, if you will, jumped in the water, swam towards the boat, and when it almost got there, he splashed it away with his paddle. And this was used by people to be like, wait, our president was afraid of a rabbit walking towards him. And when the incident got published, they had cartoon parodies that said pause instead of jaws.
Oh, that's pretty good.
Yeah, I know. And it was used to frame Carter's presidency as just an incompetent failure. And yeah, my dad would go on about Carter and the killer rabbit. So you had this one going on at the same time. And Operation Eagle Claw, like we said, is a failure. Vance has resigned. Carter is going to get his last bump in popularity, though, in December 1979 to early 1980. That is when the Soviets send troops into Afghanistan. The communist regime there was faltering. The Soviets send 50,000 soldiers in. And this is the war that in many ways will end up, of course, breaking the Soviet Union, but that's neither here nor there. Thing is that to counter this, Carter bans grain sales to the Soviets. He says, no more, we're not attending the Olympic Games, we boycott them. SALT II is dropped, and when I was taught in Cold War class, this is considered the beginning of Cold War II. Also, remember, Vance is gone, so his limiting force is no longer there. And I think his replacement was Ed Munsky, which I don't know what his deal was. But anyway, but Brzezinski's really the one calling the shots. And this is when a lot of military spending is upgraded. And a lot of the military equipment that Americans would have posters for in the 80s and 90s, the stealth bomber, those programs are started and supercharged at this time.
Yeah, the M1 tank, the B-1 bomber, the B-2 bomber, I think. The stealth program, the SR... Well, I think SR-71 was already around, but yeah, a crazy amount of shit was developed by Carter. So that's something my dad always harps on. He says, well, people say Carter sucked, but he developed a lot of cool military equipment.
Yeah, this is a bit of an irony. I mean, not an irony, just Carter didn't... I mean, Carter wasn't slicing defense budgets left and right. It should be noted that the American military in the 70s has a lot of problems. You have low morale, in a lot of cases. The Navy's strategy was very passive. The Soviet Navy is on the rise. And this should also be noted that this, in the Carter years, Ford Carter years, in the analysis of the Cold War and the mix of forces, this is when the Soviets had the best chance to win. If Brezhnev had just one day said, we're invading, this was their best shot. This when the Soviets had the most parity of land forces in Europe. So Carter is the one who begins this reinvigoration of the American military through spending. His approval rating goes up. And I did watch his speech that he gave after the Afghanistan invasion. It's one of his better speeches. I don't necessarily agree with some of this stuff. I'm not really big on the Cold Warrior deal, but,
Well, I mean, it's easy to sound convincing and exciting when you're talking about we're going to go kick some ass, as opposed to
Yeah,
we're having a moral failure of confidence, and also we need to cut back on our energy use.
I know. I know. I know it's much easier. It's just that it's like Carter couldn't figure out that Carter couldn't figure out what was going to sell to people. I guess, you know. At any rate, though, this leads to a bump in his approval rating. For the time being, but that said, you know, still you go into 1980, 12% inflation rate. The hostages are still being held in Iran. The situation is looking grim. And then, of course, he gets the challenge from Ted Kennedy. But before I go on with that, you got any other comments on this?
No, I think we've hit everything that I had.
Gotcha. Okay. Ted Kennedy decides to challenge Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter does what's became known as the Rose Garden strategy, which is I'm just going to ignore him. And Carter decides that he would put more stock into looking like, hey, I'm above this sort of stuff. If Ted Kennedy was come after me, sure thing. I'm too busy being president and dealing with an Iranian hostage crisis and the invasion of Afghanistan and all the rest. This is a successful strategy, although it does divide the party. Also, by this time, a lot of people in the party, like the McGovernites and the Union people, were rejecting Carter. Do you get any notes on the Ted Kennedy challenge?
I don't specifically. I didn't get to that part of the book, but Jonathan Alter had a little confessional in the beginning as, you know, a lifelong standard bearer for the party. He's like, yeah, I regret to say I did support Ted Kennedy in the 1980 primary, and that's one of the greatest regrets of my life.
Oh God.
But anyway, he thinks that Kennedy's primary challenge cost Carter the election of 1980, which I think is absurd.
It plays a part. I mean, it's kind of like Reagan with Ford. I mean, you're dividing the party going in. Now, and yeah, I mean, we could say that, of course, Reagan and Ford made up, but look at the way the speeches were. I mean, Ford gives the thing to Reagan. Reagan gives a last speech of the convention. That's telling. That's a sign of weakness. And Reagan's speech, he mentions Ford a little bit and then just gets into Reagan mode, right? And, you know, with these kind of challenges are very bad for a party going in. And so the party is very divided. Now, Kennedy, the conventional wisdom I would always heard is that Ted Kennedy sank himself. During an interview and asked why he wanted to become president, he didn't give a very convincing answer. At any rate, Carter, despite all of his problems, wins fairly easily, at least in terms of the primaries. But when they go to the convention, things are more divided. One of the most interesting things about the 1980 election to me is just how negative it was. And I remember in 2016, one of the stations around here would play like Johnny Carson reruns, and my friend Mindy would watch some of those. So I watched a little bit with her, and you know, Johnny Carson did like political stuff, and he had a political scientist or analyst on there talking about the 1980 election. He's like, you know what's interesting with this election? He's like, this is one of the most negative campaigns I've ever seen, and he's right. All these two guys did was say how horrible the other person was. Carter's idea was that Reagan could not be trusted, that he might start a nuclear war. Reagan's was, this man's awful, and he had the thing like, how much better do you feel? Do you feel like you're doing better 4 years after Carter's been in office?
Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?
There we go, exactly. And Reagan played the debates pretty well. Now, I've also heard that George Will leaked Carter's debate strategy to Reagan. And, you know, Reagan already being like a performer, somebody who did acting, of course, and was a salesman and public speaking. And a guy like Carter with his weirdness factor, which is really a deal, is able to turn that against him. So I'm not a big believer in debates mattering. But if somebody asked me what's the last presidential debate that actually mattered, I'd say 1980. That was the last one that seemed to really leave an impression on people, that they still mention in the literature, you know.
Although both the debates in both Carter elections were important, because remember, you know, Ford's mistake was pretty costly, because he actually had a chance of making it back into the race in early October when he made that mistake.
I guess, man. I don't think that one mattered as much.
Well,
I don't
he
know.
actually had momentum. He was gaining, and then his momentum kind of halted after
Well,
he
like I
made
said,
that big gaffe.
I still subscribe to my 13 keys to the presidency. Ford was always going to lose. Outside of Carter, like goose stepping down the street. Okay. Um, even then, there are a lot of people have been like, "Well, I mean, did you see him actually goose step?"
Right.
Uh,
Um,
but that's just my opinion on that one. I will say that this is. I think this is. I think Carter's going to lose anyway. What Reagan does in the debates is one of the things that makes it to where it's going to be a damn landslide. And Carter is slaughtered in 1980.
yes, this is pretty damn bad. He won his home state of Georgia. He won Minnesota, West Virginia, D.C., Maryland, and Rhode Island, and Hawaii. And that's it.
That's right, everybody. Massachusetts went Republican.
Yep, and back then California leaned red, so that one shouldn't be a surprise. Vermont, New Hampshire, red. Connecticut, red. New York, red. New Jersey, red. So all the places we normally think of now as being Democratic strongholds, not so much.
It should be noted, though, that since Franklin Roosevelt, most of these were landslides, most presidential elections. But I think that had to do a lot with America being a more united country overall, for a variety of reasons. And the kind of elections we have nowadays are more of a sign of, just how divided the place is. But we're not going to delve into that one. That's a whole other discussion.
Oh, also
but yeah, but
the popular vote. Reagan won with nearly 51% to just 41%. 43,
yeah.
almost 44 million to about 35.5 million.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, John B. Anderson peeled off a lot of votes that might have gone for Carter, honestly. I mean, anyway, I won't get into the Anderson candidacy. But anyway, so Carter is crushed. Should be noted, though, that even in his last few months as president, he pushed through some environmental legislation, and one of these included protecting a lot of land in Alaska. Yeah. And still worked feverishly to get the hostages freed. The hostages were not freed until Ronald Reagan was president. They specifically waited until Reagan was sworn in to free the hostages. That said, at the suggestion of Ronald Reagan, because Carter had done so much to get them out, Carter, once he left D.C., flew to West Germany and met the hostages there. And then comes back home. And very, very depressed, doesn't really know what to do, and is ignored.
Another thing before to backtrack just a bit. Another thing he did that often gets ignored is it was actually Jimmy Carter who appointed Paul Volcker to the Department of, what is it, the Federal Reserve?
I believe that would be the case. Yes. What do you want to say about that?
So Paul Volcker was called in to deal with inflation. And normally people think of Paul Volcker being a Reagan guy because he also retained that seat under Reagan. But it was Carter who brought him in and gave him the go-ahead to jack up interest to 20% in order to fight inflation. And this caused the unemployment to go up, which of course really fucked over Carter's popularity. And also when Volcker was interviewed about what struggling Americans should think about what he was doing, he said simply, the standard of living of the average American has to decline. This is a guy representing Jimmy Carter in public. So just another reason why this map went so red.
Oh, what do you know? The standard of living of Americans did decline.
It did. Paul Volcker got what he wanted.
Well, Volcker indeed got what he wanted. They say that's one of the reasons why why the Biden administration right now is not afraid of inflation, because they're like, oh, the American standard of living has dropped enough, so the workers don't have much power. Yeah, but anyways, I I don't have a ton to say about the post-presidency. Do you want to say anything, before we get into that? Do you want to say anything about the presidency?
Well, one last thing. Somebody linked it to me. The case I was referring to was the First National Bank of Boston versus Belletti. And this
Okay.
was the case that defined free speech right of corporations for the first time and effectively said that part of their free speech is that they can spend money. So, because this was in effect for the 78 midterms and beyond, this is one of the more underrated cases when it comes to money in politics. And this is also why things like Chick-fil-A and Michaels and Nike have stances on social issues. Because it really makes no sense for a corporation to have a stance on a social issue since corporations are not people. But in this case, they're saying that corporations not only are people legally, but they also have the right to express their First Amendment rights. And part of that is being able to spend a shit ton of money. So,
Well, even that, and in our own lifetime, of course, we point to Citizens United, but even before that, in the aughts, you could see the personalization of products.
yeah, I would say, look, this case, Boston versus Belletti, this is more or less part of that trifecta of 70s cases. There's the one about oil and like 73, then Buckley Vallejo 76, and now this one. That trifecta of cases is what created the current problem of money in politics. Citizens United was just steroids for that existing problem. Because a lot of people now will say, yeah, we need to get rid of Citizens United. Okay, that would help, but that does not cure the problem. The problem was created in the 70s. You have to overturn decisions such as First National Bank of Boston versus Belletti if you're really serious about trying to address the problem. Citizens United alone is not enough.
Yeah, damn. Oh man, that seems unlikely to happen, at least in the time being.
Also, another Carter fact: he appointed more federal judges than any other president ever.
Yeah, but not a single Supreme Court justice.
Not on the Supreme Court, but he did put up a lot of federal judges, and he had a candidate he wanted to put on the Supreme Court. Should have been the first woman. I can't recall her name, but eventually by 1979 he figured out that nobody was going to die, so he made her the first Secretary of Education when he created the Department of Education.
Okay.
And then, of course, and somebody did die in 1981, so Reagan got to be the first to put a woman on the Supreme Court, and it was Sandra Day O'Connor.
Yeah. Do you want to move into the post-presidency?
Sure. Now it's
Okay.
1981. Jimmy Carter's out of office. And he and Rosalind excuse me, I can never remember that. They returned to Plains, Georgia.
Yeah, they have a lot of problems. I mean, he's ignored by the press. He's just a whipping boy. I mean, throughout the early to mid-1980s, he's thoroughly despised, man. Few men have left the presidency and been more hated at that moment. I think matters worse, while he was president, his farm was being overseen by somebody else. Now, Billy Carter apparently had done stuff with the farm, but he, before Jimmy was president, of course, and had done fine, but he wasn't at that time. He was too busy trying to sell beer and model trucks, I guess. And, Carter had to fight to save the farm, but he did manage to do it. He does, of course, try to, found the Carter Center, which is international center. I do want to mention this real quick. I remembered finding this thing from The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump. And I want to quote this one for you because it's about Jimmy Carter. All right. And this one is even funnier now that Trump's been president and is also a one-term president. And according to Skronik, is also a disjunctive president. So here you go. This is Trump. You can't con people, at least not for long. You can create excitement, you can do wonderful promotion, get all kinds of press, and you can throw in a little hyperbole. But if you don't deliver the goods, people will eventually catch on. I think of Jimmy Carter. After he lost the election to Ronald Reagan, Carter came to see me in my office. He told me he was seeking contributions for the Jimmy Carter Library. I asked him how much he had in mind, and he said, "Donald, I'd be very appreciative if you contributed $5 million." I was dumbfounded. I didn't even answer him. But that experience taught me something. Until then, I'd never understood how Jimmy Carter became president. The answer is that, as poorly qualified as he was for the job, Jimmy Carter had the nerve, the guts, the balls to ask for something extraordinary. That ability, above all, helped him get elected. But then, of course, the American people caught on pretty quickly that Carter couldn't do the job, and he lost in a landslide when he ran for re-election. So there you go. There's the Trump assessment.
Yeah, apparently, though, the thing Carter was asking for money for was actually the Carter Center, which was a part of the library that he would use to do outreach to foreign countries and try to conduct diplomacy.
Yeah, apples or whatever. That's same difference.
But anyway,
No.
so yeah, that one came up, and yeah, it's funny.
I just love,
Trump would always talk about Carter as being a loser and a one-termer, and kind of became ironic eventually.
Yeah, it did. No, I mean, he didn't want to have the fate of Carter, and he's got a fate, I guess, in many ways worse.
Also, if you look at the vote total difference between Reagan and Carter, and then between Biden and Trump, I mean, by percentage, Trump did way better than Jimmy Carter, but the actual margin of victory is fairly similar in terms of the total vote difference.
Yeah, in terms of total vote difference, not as much electoral college, of course. Also, like, Trump has this fan base that Carter just didn't have afterwards. I mean, Carter had people who still admired him. We mentioned that Rickover, for one, wrote him a letter afterwards. But fan base, God, I wouldn't say that, But some of Carter's popularity comes back up in 1984 when he starts working for Habitat for Humanity, building homes. And then in 1986, him and Reagan have something of a reconciliation. Not a friendship by any means, but Reagan actually gives the speech at the Carter Library and Center when they open it, and gives a speech praising Jimmy Carter. And now, of course, he can afford to be magnanimous, but also to be fair to Reagan, that's kind of his style anyway. I mean, not that Reagan couldn't be. I mean, you're a politician, you can screw people over, of course, but I'd say one of Reagan's better qualities, much like Abraham Lincoln, is that he wasn't really a man for holding grudges, and he could also afford to be magnanimous at the same time. Yeah.
Although Jimmy Carter does hold some grudges.
Oh, most certainly.
So I remember I talked about how he fell out with Billy Graham and Oral Roberts. Let's talk about that some more. Okay, so when the Playboy interview came out during the 1976 campaign, his fellow Baptist Franklin Graham and Oral Roberts effectively said, well, Jimmy Carter must be a sinner because we're sure not. Even though that was very standard Southern Baptist rhetoric to talk about, the sin of thinking about things. I forget the exact phrasing now, but so that was something they preached from the pulpit. Now they said wasn't a thing. So for Jimmy, this was a betrayal by people who supposedly shared his faith, and he never forgave them for it. And when he was invited while president to speak at, I think it was Oral Roberts University, to give commencement, he said, "We have to send my regrets to Mr. Roberts. Unlike him, I have sinned, so I'm not fit to be in the presence of such a holy man." Or he said something to that effect.
Oh, God.
Yeah, so he was still pissed off about it. I don't think they ever made up. And he also said something equally snide to or about Billy Graham. And I think that might be part of why he was at odds with later politicians, because kissing Billy Graham's ass became a bipartisan exercise by the 80s, and Jimmy Carter wanted none of it.
Yeah, indeed. Also should be noted that he had been able to get evangelical support in 1976. I mean, not by a massive amount, but he gets some. One of the ways that he pisses it away is that while he was personally pro-life, he refused to pursue that as a policy. And then Reagan essentially tells him in the 1980s, yeah, sure, I'm pro-life.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, that's also when Jimmy Carter was with the more traditional Baptists saying separation of church and state is important. You should not legislate your personal views, and then the people under the televangelist influence were saying the exact opposite. You should legislate your values, and they
Yeah.
got most of the evangelicals behind them. Yes. Anyway, yeah, people in the chat are talking about how they've encountered Jimmy Carter here and there, and he's pretty decent in person.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, I mean, I guess he's probably mellowed with age some, and also he probably did better with just average people than he did with some of the DC types.
Well, you mentioned that because the two ex-presidents he got along best with were Ford and Nixon, who, like Carter, I mean, not that, once again, Carter grew up with. It's weird to say because we can't say Carter grew up simple. His dad had money. I mean, his dad ran a company store. But at the same time, it wasn't the pampered rich kid life, you know?
Right. I mean, there's a story about him as a kid working on the farm. He got a big splinter in his arm, and his dad shamed him for trying to take the day off. So Jimmy popped it out, like did a hasty bandage job, and went back to the fields. So it was he did a lot of physical manual labor.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess what I'm saying is that he'd get along better with normal people in a similar, and that's why I mean Nixon and Ford being like some of the last few presidents we've had, where you're just like, oh, they're not like they're not from the exalted group in America, if you will,
Yeah.
Which I guess might be the same thing with Biden as well, though I don't know a ton about Biden's background. But Biden is our first non-Ivy League president since Reagan, though. So anyway, yeah, you said that Carter had relations with some of the other presidents. Did you want to go into some of that?
Yeah. So part of the problem that Jimmy Carter's had as a post-president is that he and especially his Democratic successors have not been on good terms. So the only public feud that he had was with George W. Bush, especially over the Iraq War and some other stuff. Jimmy Carter came out to basically say Bush was full of shit and that Bush was incompetent. And he didn't really try to sugarcoat it either. He basically just said it.
Yeah.
Which was pretty unprecedented. It's not something presidents normally do. So because most of the ex-presidents have been chummy with each other, this made Jimmy Carter a pariah among the boomer presidents. Now, he got along well with his other greatest generation presidents, Ford, Nixon, and actually he and Ford did become fairly close. But of course, Ford's been dead since 2006 or so. So since that time, Jimmy Carter's been a man alone.
Do you know anything about the Nixon relationship? Because I didn't know that, because so much of what he was trying to do seemed like a repudiation of Nixon, even though in some ways he also affirmed a lot of his stuff. But I mean, do you know anything about the relationship there?
So I don't know too many details, but I do know that Carter always tried to be personally decent to Nixon. So when he was when he did his inauguration, he said it would be open to everyone, and he made a point of publicly inviting Nixon to attend. Nixon declined, but he actually did get invited to the 1976 inauguration.
Okay.
And he would do stuff like that, and I think eventually that helped win Nixon over because, nobody else was talking to him or giving him the time of day. And eventually when they have those get-togethers, he and Nixon would kind of hit it off some. But mostly Carter's only real friend among the ex-presidents was Ford.
Okay.
And I mean, as we talked about, Ford got along pretty much with everybody, so it makes sense.
Oh, no, there's got to be somebody Ford didn't get along with, right?
I mean, I'm sure there's somebody, but Ford, that was one of his talents as a politician, is that he gets along with people pretty well. And also, I don't know, now that Biden's president, though, I feel like Carter and Biden actually get along pretty well. At least I get the impression that they do.
Yeah, that's possible. What about Biden? I'm sorry, what about Obama and Carter?
I don't think there's a lot of love there. I'm not sure exactly what the problem is, but I think Carter and Obama, I think Carter might have actually endorsed Obama early on or privately endorsed him in some way in 2008. But since then, he has been disappointed in Obama, and apparently it's not really like an open split between Carter and Clinton and Obama. It's more of a thing where they just don't get along there's not really been a big blowout or anything. It just doesn't. They don't click for whatever reason.
Gotcha.
That's part of it,
Okay.
but also all of them are very split over the use of the word neoliberal. So Bill Clinton, of course, wants to be the father of the movement, so he gets pissed off when people say Jimmy Carter beat him to it. And Jimmy Carter's glad to let Clinton have it because he does not consider himself to be a neoliberal. And also, I think just based on the fact that he apparently endorsed Bernie in 2016, or at least said he voted for him, that he sees neoliberalism as a failure. And Jimmy actually has moved left over the last 40-something years.
Yes, I do remember that he was not big on Hillary Clinton. I remember that. And I also remember that when it came to the Republican primary, his opinion was mine. He said that he was more afraid of Ted Cruz than he was of Trump.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so Jimmy Carter, he also is the kind of guy who, if you ask him his opinion, he won't spare a critique. So most ex-presidents will try to play the game of, well, it's not my place to say, I don't want to get involved and tilt the scale. If you ask Jimmy Carter what he thinks about something, he'll just tell you. So that pisses off the other presidents because it violates the norm of what they think a president should do.
He's also, of course, we didn't get into all the activities he did with foreign policy, like negotiations in North Korea and the like.
Yes.
So Carter was one of your most active ex-presidents ever. I mean, Reagan, by the time he left, Alzheimer's was kicking in. By the mid-'90s, he didn't even know who he was anymore, right? Bush just kind of took it easy. Bush Sr., that is. Carter just very, very active, really.
Carter, very active ex-president, and he also has done diplomacy, sometimes working with the sitting president, sometimes doing his own thing, and the subsequent presidents have hated that about him, that he's independent-minded and willing to critique their foreign policy. So the foreign policy establishment actually thinks that this is a mistake on his part, because they also have this new orthodoxy from the last 20 years that you can never meet with dictators, period.
Oh, yeah, never, right?
And according to them, Carter has committed that cardinal sin on many occasions.
You know what I would say to him? How's that working out for you right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I mentioned, Jonathan Alter, the author of the biography I read, he's a pretty straight-line neoliberal. So he said, yeah, that's probably the worst thing about Carter is that he met with some of these dictators. But he said, well, if you think about it, it makes sense, though. I mean, he grew up in the South during Jim Crow, so he doesn't see them as being as reprehensible as other people, and he doesn't have this Manichaean worldview. So he thinks there's some good in them that he can appeal to. He's also a realist. So at least Alter is balanced enough to say, I understand why he does what he does.
Well, the Manichaean worldview thing does make some sense. I mean, Carter's dad, from what I've read, was pro-segregation. I mean, not like in the George Wallace, like let's go beat our shoe on the podium sense, but his dad was a pro-segregation guy.
Yeah.
He was not for integration. But, he's not going to hate his father, and his father had other good elements as well. At the same time, Carter was president at a time when you had to make deals with dictators to win the Cold War, even though he had problems with that. I mean, that whole mentality of like we don't meet with dictators. I mean, this is the height of stupidity, right? The world is full of other countries that have other different political forms, and they're going to continue to have other political forms. You're not going to get a one world government. You're not going to get everybody to sing Kumbaya. You're not going to have this neoliberal order that's going to expand the globe. This is a moronic fool's errand. It's failing before your very eyes. And I'm sorry, Nixon is way more brilliant than any of you. He's willing to go to China. I mean, I hate Mao Zedong, but
I think
that
Mao
is
was
a man.
dead by then, right?
No, Mao is in charge of China. Nixon met Mao. I mean, he'd have too many more years left. But I mean, what are you gonna do? Not meet with the guy? But that goes to that whole thing where they're like, "What is this, like Chamberlain?" I'm like, "There's a difference." Chamberlain gave away part of Czechoslovakia, and the Czechs weren't even in the room.
Wow.
Don't get me wrong. I don't even hate on Chamberlain that much. I think Chamberlain was wrong, but he wasn't. He had some reasons that were reasonable. For one thing, Britain was in no condition to go to war at that moment, and beyond that, Chamberlain was trying to avoid a war. I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily, right? And to Chamberlain's credit, eventually he will declare war because he realizes there's no way to make a deal once the Nazis take over the rest of Czechoslovakia. But point is, this whole don't talking to these restrictions we put ourselves in foreign policy, they've only made the other people more powerful.
Yeah.
No,
I mean, I think there's a lot of wisdom in the approach Jimmy Carter has, and also, yeah, a lot of times you're not going to be able to eliminate some dictators, but if you work with them to some extent, you might be able to get them to feed their people better, or to desist from an invasion, if you understand their interest and appeal to them in that way.
Or you can at least reduce tensions. I mean, the inability of Americans to talk to the Soviets from the late 40s into the early 60s is going to lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we do almost destroy each other.
Yes.
I mean, hell, one of the interesting things in the Cold War was, the United States and the United States Navy and the Soviet Navy would actually meet up to discuss how to handle incidents. Like, if a ship rammed another ship on accident or something.
How's that?
And it worked. Oh. It reduced tensions. And actually, the U.S. Navy treated this as a point of pride because they were like, unlike the rest of the other armed forces, we actually have like a dialogue with our opponents sort of thing, right? That allows us to reduce incidents and it gives us a certain amount of prestige and respect, if you will, right? So fascinating stuff, man. Anyway, so there's my takes on it. I know we had a lot of love for Jimmy Carter in the dialogue stuff. I do want to ask you a few other questions though. What's Obama's thoughts on the whole like neoliberal Clinton Carter argument, or neoliberalism in general? Like, what's his deal with that?
I think privately Obama is trying to claim that he's one of the godfathers of neoliberalism. In public, I think he's still trying to do that I'm above ideology thing, though.
Yeah, but his actions are very neoliberal.
Yeah, so he's kind of doing that. Whereas with Carter, he gets pissed off when people put the label on him because it didn't exist when he was president, really. At least it wasn't in common use. And he does not regard himself as that. So I think he's got a better case for getting out of it. Even though he kind of did neoliberal things, but he did not do them because he's a neoliberal, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. He did it because he was a technocrat.
Yeah, I mean, he's a literal technocrat. Maybe one of the very few we've ever seen to get that hot far in politics.
He's a technocrat and a humanitarian.
Yeah, he's kind of like Herbert Hoover in a way. Also, Hoover was a little weird, wasn't he?
I don't know a ton about Hoover, but he was never described as a warm, fuzzy type either. He definitely had the whole idea you should be frugal thing going on,
Also, Hoover always looked constipated in all of his pictures.
To be fair to Hoover, they were still coming out of that whole period where when you get your photograph taken, you got to look serious.
Yes.
And I mean, granted, some people were breaking that down, Teddy Roosevelt smiling, Woodrow Wilson smiles in a few, but there was still like a general look grim now, and then Franklin Roosevelt's there, and he's just all smiles.
Yeah, that's what FDR understood, is that people were looking for optimism in a time of despair. So he gave him the biggest fucking smile he could manage. With the
cigarette holder in his mouth.
Exactly.
Danny's convinced that the penguin, the classic Batman penguin, is just FDR the criminal.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, they got a similar look, though, But I want to ask you, if we're saying that he's not a neoliberal, reading up on him, though, in many ways he does point towards many of the ways the Democratic Party is. Concern over the environment, although he was more serious about it. A foreign policy that is moving more towards, for lack of a better term, idealism, at least on the surface, and humanitarian goals. Deregulation. Not aggressively pro-union or worker. We forgot to add that he's the first president to make it a big point to hire minorities and women in the federal government. Yeah, and famously appointed Ruth Bader Ginsburg as one of the judges. I mean, she wasn't going to the Supreme Court at that moment, but you know what I'm saying.
Right, it got her started, and she later said that without Jimmy Carter, she would never have been in a position to even get considered for the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and so many of the way the Democratic Party is going to be is really starting with Carter. And if I would say one thing about Carter and Ford in relation to this, the ways they were different is that Carter wasn't going to really lie to people. I mean, he would lie to them sometimes, of course. I mean, in the end, he said, like, hey, you need to live simpler lives. He didn't sugarcoat it, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, when on the Ford end of things, when the religious and the moral right is coming along, Ford rejects them, but he's like, look, man, I really want to do some deregulation and tax cuts, and I'm pro-business. So if you really think about it, Reagan and Clinton were doing what Ford and Carter did, but they knew how to lie about it. Because, like I say about Republicans, like Thomas Frank will say, when it comes to social issues, they're willing to compromise, even do a full-scale surrender. But when it comes to economics, they will fight you to the death.
I think he's right about that for sure. Also, I found some
Ford could have gotten around that by lying.
From Thomas
Ford
Frank.
could have been like, "I'm against abortion and women's rights." He could have done that, but he didn't do it.
Speaking of Thomas Frank, I actually consulted his newest book to see if he had anything to say about Jimmy Carter, and it turns out he did.
Okay. Well, what does he have?
So he said that Carter is a key figure in transforming populism from something that is kind of like this multiracial economic democracy into populism as a label to describe the style of presentation. So Carter never really had much of a class interest. I mean, as president, he didn't really care about unions much. He did win the union vote, but he didn't do shit for them. He didn't try to help them out when employers were trying to suppress them. He did pass, apparently, big capital gains tax cuts, which I didn't know about until I read Frank. And he basically embraced austerity to fight inflation. So yes. He did the exact opposite of what the union core of the party wanted. And I think the quote here from page 207 of The People Know, Jimmy Carter was a post-New Deal centrist who campaigned with vague populist niceness, but whose true affection was reserved for ultra-competent policy experts. And he basically says this was the blueprint for Clinton and Obama.
Yeah, I think there's truth in that. Carter and Ford are representing shifts in their parties. You're seeing it play out right then and there. And that's one thing that's been interesting about reading about them both is really seeing that, we consider Reagan the break from the FDR coalition, but the break had already happened. And, it's sometimes said has in half jest, but it might be true. Richard Nixon is the last of the New Deal. He's the last liberal president, as one person said one time. Where, liberal as Americans think of it. Yeah. Well, anyway, do you have any more comments for Carter? I know we got a few super chats to look at.
I'm sure I do. I just can't think of them right now. I guess, if I think of them, we'll go there. But yeah, let's revisit the super chats.
All right.
So Stuart Rock gave us £2. Thank you, Stuart. Many happy returns, sir.
And there's one above that, Ken Cook.
Ken Cook, $3.99. Thank you. What was the relationship between Carter and his VP? So
the VP being the VP being Walter Mondale. I don't know a ton about this, though I do know Mondale was a very active vice president. In some ways, vice presidents were already becoming more important anyway, but he really sets a template for the idea the vice president is a member of the presidential team doing things.
Yeah,
You
apparently
know.
Carter told his staff that if you hear an order from, I think his nickname was Fritz, then just assume it's from me and do it.
Okay. Yeah, the only thing I'd read about Mondale really was that he did not. He advised Carter against the crisis of confidence speech.
And he was right about that.
He was. He was. Uh, just because in mind that I mean, Mondale, of course, will be the last stand of the New Deal coalition in '84. You know, um, but no, I don't. I don't know enough about that one. I might look that one up sometime though to comment on that. Maybe if we ever do one of those like vice presidential tier rankings.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of them, it would be hard to rank them, but I know it seems like I've seen a trend as we've been doing these that every person who writes a biography of a president usually is a hardcore admirer and will say that they're the first person to empower their VP. So, according to Jonathan Alter, Jimmy Carter is the first person to empower his VP, and Nixon had no time for Spiro Agnew, although, as we mentioned in the last episode when we talked about that, Spiro actually had a pretty big role in the administration.
Yeah, that's that. What I would say is that every vice president since Mondale has been active within the presidents, within the you know, I'm trying to say there's an expectation there, and there was a growing expectation before that, but it was still kind of hit and miss. Like for instance, Nixon was active in the Eisenhower administration.
Yeah.
In fact, Eisenhower is commonly called like the one who first empowered his VP. I would probably say Truman, but you know Eisenhower, good case for that one. But you know Johnson was sidelined by Kennedy for the most part because he didn't like those. He didn't like the Kennedy brothers. They didn't like him. I mean, he was informed about some stuff, but he was not really a member of the team.
Also,
And then you know,
speaking of VPs, you know what both Ford and Carter think was the decisive factor in 1976?
no, what they think?
Ford's decision to drop Rockefeller from the ticket. Because Rockefeller was the only reason why black people and union members considered voting Republican.
Okay, so they thought that they had made some gain because okay, well, yeah, some union members. Nixon had peeled off some union members in '72.
Yeah, and I mean, Jimmy Carter wasn't exactly going out there talking about unions, so they endorsed him in the end, but it was kind of a reluctant thing. They were not enthused about Carter. So had Ford kept Rockefeller on the ticket, it's possible they either would not have endorsed or, you know, just maybe even some of them might have gone for Ford.
Okay, it's maybe, but at the same time, Ford has to do that, or there's a lot of Republicans who are going to stay home.
Yeah, so he
Yeah.
had to choose between his base and trying to play the middle. And I guess at the end of the day, you always have to choose your base because they're the votes that are more guaranteed and reliable.
Back then, there was more of a shoot for the middle kind of thing, but I mean, the fact is that Ford's base had almost claimed his head. Or
Yeah.
you know, at least the right wing of the party had come. They didn't just like give him a challenge. No, they the knives reached his neck. They almost decapitated him. You know, so you know, and then he had to end up like having like the guy who almost took the nomination from him do the last speech of the convention. You know, that's a humbling thing in some ways. Well, in many ways, but anyway. Yeah. So do you want to close up with any last thoughts on Jimmy Carter?
This is a pretty random one, but I guess one of the most famous things about Jimmy Carter is that he famously reported seeing a UFO.
He did. He did. There's the Atlantic. Like one of their articles had a cool bit of art for that. Yeah, there we go. Look at that UFO over Carter.
Yeah. So apparently this actually happened at some point in the late '60s. He came out of some meeting at a Lions Club or whatever. He looked up in the sky and he saw something weird. Apparently, it turned out that there had been a release of some gas that was 100-something miles away, and that's probably what it was. I don't know whether he knew that or not, but when he was contacted about this by some UFO group, he decided to play politics and go with it. Now, he never went out publicly and talked about UFOs because that'd make him look crazy, but he thought that he might be able to win UFO believer votes, because if he said something about them positive in private in their own little publication without anybody else seeing it, he might be able to win their votes nationwide, because he already had presidential ambitions by this early point. And so that is why he made that decision to talk about his UFO experience.
Cool.
So when people say Carter didn't play politics, bullshit.
He did the pandering thing with voters, which I'm, not necessarily a bad idea, but shit like this where it's like, yeah, man, UFOs. It's funny you mentioned that swamp gas thing. What, you're not excited for the UFO stuff getting released in June?
I'm excited to see it. I think the UFO stories are interesting at the very least. At this point, I'm pretty convinced that the things people are seeing are military aircraft, though. If you think about it, the last major announced development in fighter technology was really in the 80s with the F-22. And then the Russians talked about developing greater maneuverability in the 90s with swept forward wings and stuff like that. So we either have to believe that with especially the U.S. dumping billions and billions of dollars into defense that nothing has happened, or we have developed things that are unbelievably fast and agile. So I think most likely what are being described as UFOs are actually hyper-advanced military aircraft.
I'm going to go with aliens are visiting us.
All right.
Nah, boy, whatever. It's possible. I'm just messing, man. But it's not impossible. I'm interested to see some more, though. It's kind of like during the pandemic when they were like releasing footage from the Navy of stuff, and then nobody cared because everything else going on in the world.
Right.
But also, we're not very. I don't know. We're a very. We're people really obsessed with ourselves right now, and to be really interested in UFOs, to be interested in something outside of yourself, something bigger and grander. If a president right now, actually, when presidents do that, they go like, "We're going to go to Mars." There's always a yawn. Unlike when Kennedy was like, "We're going to go to the moon,"
Yeah, I guess to be fair, at this point, Titan and Enceladus, the two moons of Saturn, and then Europa, the moon of Jupiter, are probably more exciting destinations in terms of possibly finding something.
Yes, definitely Europa. One other thing to note to you, too, you remember Dennis Kucinich?
Yes, I do. How could I forget?
Yeah, he also said he saw a UFO.
And that did not help him in 2008.
Well, no, he had the nickname Moonbeam,
Well, also, it's interesting with Kucinich, he also had a wife half his age.
Yes, he did. I remember she was had red hair, right?
Yes, and they spent more time looking at her in the audience than Dennis on the podium.
Too bad.
Considerably more time.
At least he's got that for him, though. I know we just got one last super chat. If you want to go ahead and deal with that one,
so,
we'll.
Slatternly Skaghalter, $4.99. Thank you, sir. He asked, were the 1986 Reagan tax reforms in motion during Carter's administration, top individual rate from 50 to 37? I actually just looked that up, and according to The Atlantic, the tax rate going into the Reagan years was still at 70% as it had been from Nixon forward. It had been steadily going down, the top marginal rate. Reagan dropped it first to 69, then all the way to 50. It remained at 50 right up until 1987. So, I guess the answer is not really. I'm sure that based on the new corporate pressure in DC after all the Supreme Court decisions that we talked about, that the marginal tax rate would have decreased a little bit during a Carter second term, but I don't think it would have been nearly as much of a priority to drop that rate as it was for Reagan. And famously, Bill Clinton raised taxes back to 39%. At this time, Republicans called it communism, and they talked about how it was like this oppressive, unprecedented thing. And we also had pretty good economic growth. And currently, apparently, it is back to 39%, at least as of 2015 when Obama was still in office. I'm pretty sure it's been dropped all the way down to 28% right now, or at least under the Trump plan. Not sure exactly.
Oh God, our rotten tax policy. I want to say as the last thing for me on Carter, I do feel very mixed about him. Um, yeah, I think that's all I can really say right now. It's also getting pretty late, and I have to be up early-ish in the morning. But thank you. This has been a great talk here.
Yeah, I
I'm
mean,
glad we went.
yeah, go ahead.
I'm glad we went ahead and did this one a little sooner after Ford, just because so much with those two men, so much of what he dealt with was Ford stuff, essentially. So the presidencies are in many ways connected.
Yeah, I mean, of all the presidents who have been alive during my lifetime, I guess weirdly enough, I've always thought of Jimmy Carter as the only quote-unquote serious one. The only one who I would regard as an actual adult. I've never really had a hell of a lot of respect for most of our leaders, as most of you probably figured out. I always respected Jimmy Carter. I mean, I don't think he was that great, but at least he seemed like he was legitimate.
I see what you mean about the serious thing. I can agree with that. I'd put Bush Sr. in there too, but there is something a bit goofy and infantile about all these other people, right?
Yeah, I mean, because Carter is awkward, but he can't really help that, and it's not exactly a flaw per se. You look at someone like Nixon. I think you think more highly of Nixon than I do. I think of Nixon as being, kind of a detestable person on a personal level. I don't really feel that way about Carter. Reagan's a joke. Do what?
Yeah. The case can be made, of course, for Nixon's being personally detestable, but definitely a serious man.
He's a serious man. He's a smart guy, but personally, I'm not that impressed by him. Ford, I don't take too seriously. Reagan's a clown. Bush Sr. comparatively doesn't come off that terrible, but not that impressed. Bill Clinton's a joke. George W. Bush is the fucking Antichrist. Barack Obama is two-faced as hell. Donald Trump, I mean, goddamn, what do you even say there?
Carnival Barker?
And then, Joe Biden at this point. There's not much of them left. So.
Yeah. Well, stay tuned, everybody. I know in June we'll be doing Ronald Reagan. My opinion of him is a little more positive than yours, but I wouldn't call it positive overall. But anyways, you're gonna read up on Reagan to get ready for that one for in June.
Yeah, I'll do that sometime in June. Also, I forgot to tell you, but I'm gonna be out of town 1 week in June, so we might have a missing week.
Yeah, not a problem, man. Unless, how long are you going to be out of town for?
Well, and this is assuming all the flights make. I might be back in time for a show, but I'll have been gone the entire week up to that point.
Gotcha. Well, that might be, if you're in time for one, that might be a perfect time to do some Union Corps Commander tier rankings, right?
Yeah, it'll be the week of June 6th, so.
Week of June 6th. All right, D-Day. Gotcha.
Yeah, because I think we're actually supposed to get back on a Saturday before the 13th. But I'm not sure. And our flight keeps changing times for some reason. Which is weird.
Sunday. 13th is a Sunday.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. I mean, if not, we'll just do one some other day that week if you want to. Or just take a break for a week,
Yeah, I mean, we'll figure it out when we get there. I forgot to tell you earlier, so figured I'd do that.
All right, no problem, man. Well, thanks very much. It's been a great conversation here.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for Jimmy Carter. I hope you all had enough peanuts to last a while, because I don't see us revisiting Jimmy Carter anytime soon.
Not in this detail.
Yeah. All right, well, good night, everybody. Thank you for all the super chats. Thank you for everybody who showed up. We actually had a higher turnout than I expected, considering that it's Jimmy Carter. And Good night and good luck to all. Don't fall victim to malaise.